nightmare to others!
Today on the Restitutor Orbis channel, we explore the account of Jules Verne, the author who lived from 1828 to 1905. Jules Verne, the seemingly prophetic science fiction author, although his literary style was called Romanticism at the time, who was born in Nantes, France. A very interesting individual who lived during that questionable time frame of the 1800s. Why does Jules Verne warrant our attention? It would seem that Jules Verne was the visionary who contrived many of the ideas of wondrous technological advancements that would supposedly come out of the 1800s and then play a key role to this day in the 1900s and the so-called 21st century. Whatever year it actually is, we can certainly debate on that. But Jules Verne is interesting because we have few images of him due to the fact that he was born prior to the invention of the camera and the fact that his life seemed to have many different twists and turns to it. We're going to examine the background of Jules Verne's life and how he grew up in Nantes, France, and became the actual author that he is. He was also an accomplished poet and a playwright, as many people seem to be during that time. Although to give him credit, he didn't actually have avocations. His desire to be an author was his primary profession, which makes him quite unique in the annals of the 1800s. When we look at the background of Nantes, France, we see many wondrous examples of old world architecture. And of course, the mainstream explanation for this will be, well, this is France. This is part of Europe. They had hundreds of years to build all these wondrous structures. And of course, if you watch any modern movies that are set in France, you'll see no shortage of examples of old world architecture. Nantes, France is no exception to this. Being located only about 30 miles from the Atlantic, it's a wondrous and beautiful community to this very day. Of course, I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll disagree with that assessment, but looking at the images and having the fact that this is the city where the great Jules Verne hails from, and it should be noted that Jules Verne is very well known. Although, of course, Nantes, France has its unfortunate elements of history, as every other area in the world does, such as with the French Revolution. We can certainly see, though, that this would be a city that would inspire somebody such as Jules Verne with its impressive architecture and its very rich cultural background. It should be noted that Jules Verne's family wanted him to pursue the legal profession, especially his father. And indeed, this was a point of contention between Jules Verne and his father. His father wanted him to follow in the legal profession, and therefore sent him off to Paris to be educated in law. But Jules Verne persisted. He wanted to be an author, as he felt that was his primary calling. And when you look at some of the more specific examples in Nantes, France, you'll see that there's no shortage of incredible cathedrals, such as the eponymous Nantes Cathedral, where they're supposedly renovating it, and that explains why we have this color difference. Considering the account of this very cathedral in Nantes, they were allegedly building it for over 100 years. Yes, another one of these cathedrals that they built over 100 years, and yet managed to maintain consistency and continuity in the construction, and managed to lay it out with total geometric precision. Yes, once again, another example of tremendous and incredible architecture from a time frame that was shortly after the bubonic plague had hit Europe. And again, no less impressive than the other cathedrals that you have across France and across the land. And this supposedly has a bit of a Gothic styling to it. Of course, there does seem to be other elements to it. One could understand why Jules Verne, when he was walking around the town, would be inspired by such sights as this. Although we are considering the question, did Jules Verne really exist, or is he merely a compilation individual, another individual who may have released the wonders that we have from the previous civilization? Looking inside the cathedral, again, we see examples of great architecture and geometric precision within the wondrous pillars and columns, and indeed in the arches and the ceilings. We've seen this before, and we'll see this again in our explorations. Now, no one will build like this today. We'll try to replicate it, and we have our usual reason for why we don't do it. It's too expensive, it's too difficult. We don't have craftsmen and artisans on every corner who are just hanging out waiting for employment, and we don't have the logistics capacity that we did in the 1800s for reasons unknown. Of course, this cathedral would include a wondrous and amazing organ that could no doubt transmit incredible sounds. I'm always intrigued by the effect of sounds on the human psyche and the body, and it seems that the power of sound is something that we're oftentimes quick to dismiss. We see that once again there's no shortage of modular construction within this cathedral. And so, back to the early life of Jules Verne, we have this individual who was born, and yet you would expect the society would not be supportive of someone to develop a creative mind. But there's always the exception to every rule, and there's always a polymath or someone who's brilliant wherever you need them. And when Jules Verne was actually in Paris, there was an abdication going on of the French King Louis, one of the many kings named Louis, and this also supposedly jump-started the social revolutions in 1848 across the land that we explored during the Reset War of 1847-1848. Who knows exactly what was really going on? You can still visit the museum dedicated to Jules Verne in Nantes, France to this day. And naturally, it's another old world building that we're informed was built during the 1800s. Because what else would it be? It's situated on a hill and has nothing questionable about it whatsoever. Just a nice, very pretty tower and what we might even consider more generous gingerbread construction. Or perhaps a different pattern that you might want to let me know in the comments what you think it looks like. It has a tower and it's marked as the Jules Verne Museum, and you can visit it to this day and obtain a great appreciation for this wondrous visionary and prophet. Now, if Jules Verne did really exist and his life developed as we're told, then we have someone who managed wonderful creative achievements and was somehow able to predict the exact development of technology in the 1900s to today. Very impressive achievements. And of course, Nantes includes a wondrous column, another column that's dedicated to another king named Louis. Believe me, there are no shortages of kings named Louis in France, just like there were no shortages of kings named Henry in England and France in the distant past. Some of these wondrous structures never cease to amaze me, though, with their size and eminence, and it's amazing trying to think of how the mainstream historical account justifies the construction of these very large and well-constructed buildings, some from the 1700s, and that's how they try to use the history within Europe to justify the construction, although there is also the justification of the industrial revolutions that were going on. And it should be noted that when Jules Verne lived, it was during the so-called Victorian era, when we have this other occurrence of asylums and workhouses and some of the darker sides of society. They also have a really nice arcade in Nantes, so if you're over in France, I can definitely recommend this as a wonderful old world destination to visit. And even if you don't exactly approve of these theories, it's still very pretty and there's many unique locations to see. One could understand why you'd have a great shopping experience seeing this kind of artistic and creative beauty all around you. But to this day, we have managed to establish modern skyscrapers across Europe, and it's also interesting when you go to Paris and you see how that movement has been established. But Jules Verne managed to persist in his desire to write creative novels, and that was his first calling in life, and we're going to take a close look at what he exactly wrote. It's intriguing to think of his development, though, with conflicting with his father, given his father's desire to pursue the legal profession. And how many other individuals do we have this story for when they're given a path in life and it's something that they're pushed for by their father? Typically they accede to what their father wants or their family wants. Nice theater. Again, never a shortage of theaters or opera houses with all of these wondrous details of the old world in them. And if the mainstream account is true, and if Jules Verne really was brought up in such a city, then perhaps these sites could explain how he was able to develop this creative imagination that he had in his works. This is Pierre-Jules Hetzel. This was Jules Verne's publisher and editor, and once Jules Verne met him, he was really a significant force in ensuring that his works were published. It should be noted, though, that officially Jules Verne's literary reputation has suffered, especially in the so-called English-speaking nations, at least that's what the official account says, because of the fact that many of his works were edited or abridged, and therefore many of the people, when they read Journey to the Center of the Earth, one of Jules Verne's most well-known works, they didn't read the full version of it. And so it's oftentimes attributed to just being a child's novel or something that's just the product of some wild Frenchman's imagination. And yet there is such a greater degree to Jules Verne's works, and if you decide to read his books and really indulge in his novels, I strongly suggest you read the unabridged editions. There's many interesting clues and hints and perceptions that we have in the novels that really match with the research that we do. Considering the fact, though, that these are attributed to simply be imaginatory or children's novels, funny that they even consider that when you consider how complicated they are and how deep they are in plot, you realize that Jules Verne either had some sort of template in his mind, or he must have been a creative visionary. He's also attributed across the land, for example, Jules Verne Park in Tampa, Florida. For some reason, Jules Verne is well featured in Tampa, Florida, and if anybody knows why, let me know in the comments. Yes, I know why. I would just like you to see why they concern themselves with Jules Verne in Florida. You'll get a couple hints further on in this exploration. There is even a monument to him in Spain in some of his works. So here we have an individual that was from France during the high time of nationalism who managed to surpass those bounds and be well known across the land. But who exactly did Jules Verne inspire? How did he inspire these people and why? Let's take a look at the works of Jules Verne in his books. It should be noted he was a contemporary of Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas of Three Musketeers fame. One of his earliest works was 5 Weeks in a Balloon, or Three Englishmen Go to Africa. And oddly enough, you see this theme with many of Verne's works where it involves some sort of unique form of transportation, especially for the 1800s. And indeed, this is where Verne supposedly established his reputation of being an explorer. And you can also see this theme in many of his novels where you have some advanced form of transportation, some unique technology, and Jules Verne is remembered as being sort of the father, if you will, of science fiction. We look at his next well-known novel, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, which involve a journey to the North Pole. I can't imagine who that would have inspired in the future. And remember that this was written during the middle of the 1800s and the 1860s. And so you have these amazing adventures. And there's even an account of how when Jules Verne was a child, he listened to his teacher tell a story of someone who ended up like Robinson Crusoe. We also have a journey to the center of the earth, indeed one of the most enduring stories from Jules Verne that involves individuals exploring beneath the earth's surface. So here we have accounts of other lands, other means to access other lands using more advanced technology. Again, was this just the product of Jules Verne's imagination, or was there something else? We have From the Earth to the Moon, one of the first examples of a story of actually traveling to the moon. Although we're informed that Kepler actually had a story of this, and he used his mother's spells to reach the moon, at least according to Carl Sagan. But we don't need to be mentioning Carl Sagan with Jules Verne, at least not today. And perhaps the more widely known Around the World in 80 Days, again, using advanced forms of transportation to actually traverse the land. I like how they depict the world on a flat map, but of course you're watching this on a flat screen, so you're going to see it on a flat map, which fortunately works on a flat screen. I'm just noting that. And then perhaps Jules Verne's most well-known from the 20th century work, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And we have another advanced form of transportation in the form of a submarine. Some people attribute the idea of the submarine to Jules Verne, although it should be noted that there were many ideas considered for the design of the submarine, supposedly, in the mid-1800s. You might recall when we explored the USS Alligator from the United States Navy for its employment during the Civil War. Of course, it did not have the capabilities of the Nautilus that was featured in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but there were many of the same principles. And indeed, when you see some of the artwork of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you can get an idea for the imagination in Jules Verne. And this is why I strongly recommend that you read many of his novels for yourself and get the idea of what he was truly alluding to. And then you even have one of his latter novels, The Lighthouse at the End of the World. And many ideas and great implements of technology that are featured in Jules Verne's work. But beyond that, he also features these interesting views of this struggle of humanity. Who did he inspire? Admiral Richard E. Byrd, no less, with that story of exploring the North Pole, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras. Yuri Gagarin, because if you're going to go to space, you may as well read Jules Verne's novels, or whatever space we're going to. Wernher von Braun, because he was inspired by Jules Verne as well. American rocket engineer Jack Parsons, and if you've never heard of him, I suggest you look him up. He's a very interesting individual. He has lots of interesting backgrounds, including his affiliation with Aleister Crowley. I'm not making this up. You should really read about Jack Parsons. And least we forget Dr. Emmett L. Brown, who was so inspired by Jules Verne, he invented a time machine out of a DeLorean and then named his children after Jules Verne. So let's take a look at Jules Verne's technology, or at least some of the implements of technology that were introduced to the wider population in Jules Verne's works. We have the submarine, and we talked about this concerning the Nautilus and its effects on future development. Indeed, the United States Navy's first nuclear submarine that did indeed go explore up in the polar regions, as we're told, was named the Nautilus, in honor of Jules Verne's Nautilus and Captain Nemo's Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The intriguing thing, though, about Jules Verne is that he did inherently consider his characters, whether they were traveling under the sea, going to the moon, whatever the moon was really supposed to be within his stories. I mean, maybe it's the moon as we think of it in space. We don't really know. I certainly advise you to read the story and come to your own conclusions. There's also the inspiration that we seem to have from Verne's works, because he had an understanding of additional capabilities, a lot of these implements of technology, before they were in widestream use. Indeed, Jules Verne is also credited as the innovator of the steampunk genre, the Victorian, technologically advanced civilization. Did it really exist, or was it merely a product of his imagination? There is also the influences that Jules Verne has on science fiction. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke to talk about Dr. Brown and his DeLorean, but at the same time, it's also rooted in reality. The entire concept of a submarine. How advanced could a submarine be? There are some people that suggest that submarines are completely useless from a military standpoint, although from the official history we're told that the use of an undersea U-boat force by Germany during World War I and World War II nearly brought about victory, until greater technology was developed to counter the threat of the U-boat force. Strangely enough, there's many other interesting details within Verne's works where you can see visiting other lands, other civilizations, and other implements of technology. And this is why Jules Verne is considered the father of science fiction, because if you think on this, this is the very root of what science fiction is. But is this really science fiction? Or as John Colicos said when he was talking about Gene Roddenberry, is it actual science fact that's merely being introduced to the population as science fiction? These are interesting ideas when you step back and consider them. Now, whatever's really going on with our space program, it should be noted that there was even considered to be a ride for Jules Verne land and defunct land. And interesting, given Jules Verne's unique behind-the-scenes connections with Florida, that they consider doing this. And Jules Verne's association with airships. Now, what makes this all so interesting in this development of science fiction and these ideas of technological advancement? Where did they really come from? We're assured now that the development of the airship or the balloon was in the distant past. It was even before the 1800s. And yet, along with architecture, we have too many examples of too many things that were innovated, built, and constructed during the 1800s. And so it seems as though there's an overlap. There's a bit of an inconsistency. And so was this really just the product of the wild imagination of some random author in the 1800s who disobeyed his father's desires to become a lawyer? Or was there something more to this? Was this particular author referencing what he had known or somehow had knowledge of? Or was this merely a planned release of this knowledge, of these technological capabilities, to prepare a population for potential explorations of other lands that had been neglected, or the reintroduction of technology that was going to be used in a newer civilization? It almost seems as though it's a product of cycles, and if you step far enough back, you can get that impression. Again, this will be derided and will simply be stated that this was merely an individual who used their imagination, had an awareness of what was really going on in the 1800s, and could act in a prophetic manner, and therefore anticipate not only technological developments, but how technology was going to be applied in society. Perhaps you could argue it was because of his legal background that Jules Verne had studied, that he was able to anticipate exactly what technological advancements would be incorporated in society and exactly how they'd be incorporated. That's quite a prophetic nature that he has there, the ability to anticipate what's going on in the future. And yet that's actually one of the mainstream explanations for how he was able to anticipate all these things. Now let's look at some of Jules Verne's maps that he has in his works. Now, what's interesting about the maps? Well, we talked about several of the novels which indicate travel to very exotic locations, to include the North Pole, Under the World, and other such elements. Looking at some of these maps, though, we're told that they were inspired by other maps that we've looked at on this channel before. Maps which show areas that either were drawn by cartographers who didn't exactly know what they were doing, or they were employing their imagination a little bit too much, or they were going off of the ramblings of random explorers who didn't document things very well. Interestingly enough, though, author Umberto Eco has done a book considering this, called Legendary Lands, where he actually looks at many of these maps and how they either inspired human imagination or were inspired by human imagination. Recall that Umberto Eco wrote The Name of the Rose, and that he also believes that one of his family members was a foundling. Looking at the maps, though, we can see that even in this map of the North Pole, there's even the indication that there might be land up in that particular area. Of course, that is dismissed now to this day. We're told the only thing that's up there is ice, and indeed the many maps show that, along with nothing that's remotely questionable. And yes, my sarcasm meter's off the charts right now. But what really is up there? Well, apparently nothing very interesting. It's just ice, and you can take the guys from Top Gear up there and they can camp out, or you can surface a submarine through the ice. We recall the earlier Mercator map, though, that does show that there was land up there. And people will explain this, that Mercator simply didn't know what he was doing. He was going off the ramblings of explorers who didn't know what they were doing, and no one was going to possibly verify this. So use these as adequate charts of navigation, and suddenly you can explain why the Franklin expedition was lost for years in the 1850s. At least that's what we'll be told. Yet there's other depictions in maps of Verne's work which indicate a greater nature to the land, that there's other paths of access, that there's other lands that you can access, such as in Journey to the Center of the Earth. Indeed, this inspired many works all through the 20th century or the 1900s. And looking at some of the maps in terms of what's under the surface. What really is under the surface? Well, if you watch that wondrous film from the early 2000s, The Core, it'll show you exactly what's under the surface. And it's nothing particularly entertaining. I'm being facetious a little bit, but looking at some of these maps and considering that Jules Verne was one of the authors that actually explored what was under the land. I mean, is there anything under the land? Is it just dirt as far as the eye can see? Are there boreholes that go to different dimensions? Or is there something else entirely? Or is it a question we're just not supposed to ask and we're just supposed to accept the scientific explanation? There's a core down there, it generates the magnetic field, and if it gets knocked out of alignment or if there's issues with it, we may have to send an expedition down there to go restart the core. I mean, I know it's just a science fiction movie, just like this is just a science fiction story, but recall that there was once a time when they said that going to the moon was just a science fiction story and the product of wild imagination. But officially, we have been to the moon multiple times in the 1960s and the 1970s. We just can't do it now because we scrapped the technology. We had an order from the president at the time, we scrapped the technology, and even though we have more advanced computers now than we ever did, we're still trying to figure out how to do it. And you'll see the accounts of Florida and some of the interesting maps of Florida, as though Jules Verne had a special fascination with the particular area in some of his novels. And indeed, you consider the center point of Tampa. There's going to be an upcoming on-the-ground exploration of Tampa, and we're going to look at it from a fresh perspective, looking at some of the old-world constructions there. There's other maps of development that are interesting to look at within the perspective of Jules Verne's work. The development of technology, the exploration of the lands, and what's really the theme behind it. We look at these older maps and concern ourselves with how they may integrate into some of the maps that were replicated or reproduced or supposedly innovated from Verne's own works and his own explorations. No doubt this would inspire explorers such as Admiral Byrd to go seek things out in the polar expeditions, or Yuri Gagarin to go up into space and see what's really going on up there, because we have so many accounts of it. Or could this simply be referring to some other land that there's another means to access that we don't fully understand? Is that really what's being alluded to in these works? Well, you can easily dismiss this as just the product of science fiction until it's not. But we've seen many of these maps before, and we've seen many of these explorations where we have these interesting anomalies that tend to defy the traditional explanation that we're given. Why is it something applies in one situation, but it cannot apply in another situation, and yet the mainstream would tell us that it does apply in both situations? It seems to be something that comes up quite frequently. Indeed, if you read Around the World in 80 Days and actually look at some of the accounts, some of the people that are encountered and what lands they actually visit, you suddenly have a very different understanding of how the entire world may really look. Now, is that because that's how it really looks, or is that simply the method of Jules Verne's writing? Who knows for sure. There's even the interesting account of mysterious islands being found in unique locations. And we look at recent accounts of how islands just seem to have been suddenly discovered where no one knew there were islands before. There's a particular island that escaped Union prisoners in a Jules Verne story named Lincoln Island because Lincoln was just such an awesome president, and nobody debates that. But looking at these maps and these explorations and these colorful characters from these science fiction novels, or these children's stories as the English-speaking world regarded them, we seem to have a world that's laid out for us that's far more fantastic and far more amazing than we're led to believe. Now, is that really what it looked like? Or is there something else behind this story? Perhaps there's something more that Jules Verne was alluding to, or at least the powers that be were alluding to when they released these stories, this technology, and these accounts to us. Well, let's take a look at one final work of Jules Verne's, Master of the World. Someone was asking me on a comment about a film that concerned a great airship, and one of those films was 1961's Master of the World. Now, it should be noted the screenplay of Master of the World was done by Richard Matheson, and he combined two Jules Verne's works, Rober the Conqueror and Master of the World, into a film. The film stars Vincent Price as the character Rober, who is utilizing his airship, called the Albatross, to actually prevent civilization from having the capability to make war on itself. It's a very interesting film because it does show the employment of airships and what the technology can represent. Now, you can certainly say that Rober, the main character, who's portrayed by Vincent Price, and Vincent Price is always very entertaining to watch on screen, is merely a reflection of Captain Nemo, and while there are some similarities, there is a difference in how Rober goes about his implementation of removing the capability of society to commit war. It's also intriguing to consider that some of the cast includes Charles Bronson, so you get to see Charles Bronson go head-to-head with Vincent Price in this film. Now, the effects are very dated, but consider the time frame that this film was actually released, and also consider what this film was truly reflecting from the imagination of both Jules Verne and Richard Matheson. What were they really showing, and what were they really trying to say? The main star, of course, in addition to Vincent Price and Charles Bronson, happens to be the Albatross itself. Quite an imagination they had to depict an airship such as this, and this is one of the very centerpieces of what we consider to be the steampunk genre to this very day. And this is why Jules Verne is attributed as being the main innovator of steampunk, and also science fiction. But the film really considers the struggle of one civilization giving way to a new civilization. And why is it a new civilization is constantly at war with itself, especially in regional conflicts? And yet Rober is considered the conqueror. He's going to be master of the world with his airship, the Albatross. That gives him a military capability that exceeds the military capability of other nations. So is he really any different? It's up to Charles Bronson's character and the other cast to stop him in his dastardly deeds. Now, it may seem like it's a very simplistic film from the early 1960s, but there are some deeper themes and a lot more complexity in it, indeed as there is in the more well-known 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So it does look and give a modern incarnation of what was being written about in these so-called Victorian-era novels, and I can strongly recommend it as a film about an airship. And so let's consider the final question. Who exactly was Jules Verne? How did he actually have this capability to anticipate the technological developments that were going to headline the 1900s in the 1800s? And we look at our five eras theory, and we ponder the question. This individual who is from France, who is supposed to be a lawyer based on his family's profession, and yet he decided for himself that his profession was going to be writer. Now, it's a great story, and it's a great biography that is well documented, but if we look at this time frame, these reset years, and we look at the Victorian era or the 1800s as being set right during this time frame in which the reset between the fourth and the fifth era occur. We look at the release of all of these elements of technology, at least in terms of concepts and ideas, which did come about in the 1800s. Officially, the submarine was invented in the 1800s. It was tested and used in the United States Civil War. There's supposedly an earlier edition of the Turtle in the Revolutionary War, although make of that what you will. But then it goes beyond submarines. Jules Verne wrote extensively about the concept of airships. And indeed, when you look at the aspect of Master of the World and how it was reflected in the sightings of mysterious airships at that time frame towards the late 1800s, there's suddenly many more details in these stories and what Jules Verne was trying to share with the population at that time. Now, is it because he was really creative and was brilliant that he was able to anticipate how all these technological advancements were going to come about and be integrated into civilization? Or was this really part of a controlled release of information to prepare people for what the new civilization was going to be? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Orphans of the Sky, Understanding a Forgotten Past. Defenders of the mainstream account will allude to the fact that there are numerous libraries across the land which contain the totality of a compendium of human knowledge, which is cataloged in these great books. And yet there are many competing and conflicting perspectives, even amongst the mainstream, to discern exactly what happened. What are the true events of our history? In this exploration, we're going to concern ourselves with an alternative account, and we're going to look at what some of these works of what may be fiction, or might be nonfiction, tell us about our distant past. We begin with the account of Sky Cities, a Lost Wonder. And here in this image you can see that was taken in China several years ago that shows us a city in the clouds. Now this could well be a doctored or an altered image, but it does give us the idea of the wonder of a city existing in the clouds. And why are we focusing on this? Because there are many accounts of cities that once existed in the clouds. And of course I'll start with the most obvious example from non-fiction. Isn't it funny how we call non-fiction the actual historical account, as opposed to fiction, or in this case, science fiction. Science fiction being a numerous group of stories that displayed or depicted sky cities. And why are sky cities so alluring to us? Because they show an element of fantasy and imagination that is not something that we encounter in our day-to-day activities. Now, of course, we're informed by the mainstream that there has been many different designs and proposals to have floating cities or very large floating structures, such as the floating fortress island, which the United States military has proposed over the last 20 years. But with this concept of sky cities, we're actually looking at the very impressive architecture and structures that could defy gravity. Not only are they just floating on the water, but they would be floating on the air. And you might be surprised to know that there are numerous mythical and legendary accounts that allude to sky cities. Indeed, even the one in Gulliver's Travels. And of course, we always remember our favorite floating head from our unique science fiction movie from the 1970s, John Borman's Zardoz. But perhaps the most unique implementation of sky cities is that they display a very advanced technology. That if you had the capacity to build and operate sky cities, how exactly would they sustain themselves in the air? What would be their power sources? And how would they defy the very means of being pulled back to the land? Or gravity, or whatever scientific explanation you're going to go with for what actually draws objects back to the ground. There are many different designs and possibilities, though, for the designs of these unique sky cities. And they tend to incite our imagination as to other possibilities for existence. Imagine what kind of existence that we could have as a civilization if we were able to achieve sky cities. Now, going to the example of Gulliver's Travels, one of the things that Gulliver's Travels concerned itself with was the possibility of a utopian or a dystopian civilization. My particular mindset is that if a civilization goes about pursuing the perfect existence, then perhaps that's one of the sure paths to it being a dystopian existence. And you might find that a little bit of a conflict in terms or ideals, but I'll explain. When a civilization devotes itself to the pursuit of a utopian existence from the society or the group's perspective, then it is certain that it will create a society or a civilization that does literally make it a dystopia for the individual. And you can find no shortage of examples of that in both science fiction and non-fictional studies, including our actual history. Now, the other interesting thing about sky cities is how exactly would they operate? How would they exist in concert? Or would they not need to exist in concert? We also consider the numerous examples that we have of city-states in our official historical account. We're told that many of the early civilizations relied on the account of city-states. Now, this could simply be the fact that they were walled cities, such as Athens in ancient Greece from the mainstream historical account, or could this be alluding to a different existence? And you might be surprised to know that when you look into accounts of certain myths from various cultures across the land, there's not one I can cite because there's many examples, they do speak of floating islands, floating cities in the sky. Now, these can easily be dismissed as legend or myth, and they have no veracity or historiosity within them, and that may well be true. But once again, it's another one of those ideas, another one of those creative concepts that's repeated far too often to be ignored. And why is it repeated? Is it because it's such an alluring and attractive idea to the concept of establishing cities in the sky? Or was there some reality on it which it was based? Now, oftentimes we tend to associate what's in the sky with divine beings, or indeed the very concept of heaven itself, or the paradise that everyone wants to ascend to once their mortal life ends. At least that's in most of the primary religious beliefs. But what if there was a little bit more to this? A reality of an entire civilization that had once existed in the sky, that had the ability to use their technology to establish such wondrous structures, and then consider these entire constructions themselves. Now, the mainstream tells us that the concept of sky cities is science fiction. There is no practical way to achieve this. Although there are several recent films where we have the concept of very large, colossal structures that are able to defy the forces of gravity, or whatever you want to consider the forces are that draw objects to the land. And perhaps one of those recent movies that you can look to is Interstellar, with the concept of the evacuation of humanity, with the dwindling of life and the capacity of life on Earth, at least according to that film, to sustain life. But what do these cities really point to? If they did in fact exist, they point to an entirely different form of existence. The ability of a civilization to ascend its technological advancement to where they could actually establish megastructures in the sky. Now, we have to ask the question, if these did exist, what happened to them? Could it be possible that they're in other lands? Could they be in other dimensions, separated by portals? Or did they all simply just crash back to the physical realm or the current lands that we reside on now? We don't know for sure, but we have different accounts of such things happening. And indeed, in previous explorations on this channel, and indeed several live streams, we looked at the whole principle of sky cities, or cities that manage to float in the very clouds, and not just on water. Now, comparing and contrasting that with some of the principles that we have, we can find other modern science fiction examples of sky cities, or perhaps the most well-known, Cloud City, featured prominently in Empire Strikes Back, what is considered to be the finest Star Wars movie, of course. Opinions vary, and many of the current Star Wars directors will tell you that their film is the finest one. Whatever the case may be, the design and concept of Cloud City in Star Wars really gave the mainstream their first view of what a sky city could really be like. And as we understand the concept of the Cloud City that was featured in Empire Strikes Back, we understand that its entire purpose was simply to be a gas mine within what was supposed to be a gaseous planet or a gaseous environment. We saw the ability of the city to maintain itself within the clouds and to actually float and then have an entire purpose. We also saw the entire layout and the fine design and cross-section of this city, which alluded to its own power source and the ability of transportation and access throughout Cloud City in and of itself. It also showed that every single portion of this city had a function, and it was indeed modeled towards efficiency. Yet it also showed that the society, the people that were living on it, lived in relative comfort. At least that's what was shown in the film. And here in this cross-section, you can get an idea for how potentially complex and quite incredible this construction could be. Now, was this all just science fiction? Was this all just from creative imagination? It's entirely possible. Or could there be something else? Could there be something else within our subconscious that we were drawing upon? Some sort of suppressed memory that exists that we are only vaguely aware of. And yet, by being in touch with our creative elements of our minds, really what we're doing is we're drawing on old hidden memories. There are many different explanations, and I'm not going to suggest that I have the answer, merely suggesting other possibilities for where these wondrous creative ideas came from, because they had to start from something. They had to come from somewhere. And perhaps that's the most intriguing element when we consider sky cities, in addition to how wondrous their possibilities may be. Now, there's also several people who claim to have seen in the distant future or visualize the distant future, and they see humanity ascending to the clouds once again and living in sky cities, or perhaps another version of what we would consider city-states. Because once again, how would these cities actually be connected? Well, they could still be part of an overall civilization, but each city having its own representation and its own means of existence and its own particular rituals and habits and social means and mores. And suddenly it gives you a lot greater flexibility to live and operate within a greater civilization. Imagine if you could simply move from one city to the next and you had the ability to experience many different environments. Now, people will say that's exactly what we have with our cities that currently exist on the land, and that is true in many respects. Of course, there's also the other opinion that states that many of our cities are vast failures, are mismanaged, and they oftentimes have quite the worst aspects of human existence within them. All these things are true, but I think one of the reasons why it's important to understand the very creative element that comes from sky cities, cloud city, or whatever you want to call these aerial structures, that they provide us a safe haven from some of the disasters that can occur on the land, such as extreme weather. And we certainly know, with all of the use of the words dome that we've had over the past couple weeks, that having a haven from the weather would be quite an interesting consideration. You would no longer be affected by weather patterns. You would also be safe by the very shifting of the land, regardless of whatever the nature of the fault lines are or the earthquakes that occur, why they occur, and with what frequency they occur. Well, if you're living in a city in the clouds, if your entire civilization is in the clouds, you needn't worry about earthquakes or shifting fault lines or any of the realities that represents. And then there's numerous other forms of extreme weather that these cities would be above of. Imagine never having to worry about a tornado or a hurricane or a cyclone or the terrifying typhoons that we have that afflict our lands and all the other names that we have for our new weather patterns, whether it's a derecho, a polar vortex, and least we forget the possibility of flooding or great tsunamis that completely sweep over the land. These are all the dangers that sky cities would alleviate instantly, but they're just the idea of science fiction. Or is there more of a reality to them? What do you think? Orphans of the Sky is a science fiction novel written by one of the original American science fiction authors, Robert Heinlein. Orphans of the Sky was published in the early 1960s, although it should be noted it's a composition of two earlier works by Heinlein that were published in 1941 in Astounding Science Fiction, the magazine. What's intriguing about Robert Heinlein, in addition to being one of the very first science fiction writers who was of notoriety in the United States, is that he served as a naval officer in the 1930s, fortuitously just before the time when the United States Navy began its massive expansion. He was also an aeronautical engineer. What's interesting about Orphans of the Sky is it's one of the very first plots that deals with a generational ship. Now, granted, the setting of this novel is in space, as it's science fiction, but just imagine any sort of ship in any sort of environment traveling for generations. And part of the issues that arise in the story is the fact that there was a mutiny, and the officers, or the individuals who had knowledge of the mission and the functions of the ship, were killed. And then you were left with this crew that had to try to figure out exactly what was going on. And because of the fact that the ship was floating through space for such a long period of time, or whatever environment it was actually in, or you can imagine it being in, eventually the individuals that resided on the ship completely lost not only awareness of its functions, but its entire purpose. The original novel was called Universe because the entire ship was considered the entire world. That's how much these individuals had lost their knowledge not only of the workings of the ship, but also of their very existence. And this is a very interesting idea, and Heinlein was one of the first ones to propose it in these novels. I also find it again quite a coincidence that he served in the United States Navy just before the United States Navy began its large expansion for World War II and during World War II. There's the element of losing the knowledge of what your actual existence is. And this might even be a way of explaining mass amnesia. also consider how we can compare and contrast this with our many examples that we have of civilizations that had fallen from the past. Now, mainstream history likes to inform us that we never really lose any knowledge of a civilization. There's no such thing as a true lost civilization. There's only legend and myth, and those are allegedly easy to disprove. Yet at the same time, no one will ever forget about the Roman Empire, because despite the fact that aspects of the Roman Empire and different elements of its knowledge or different categories of what was written about it was constantly rediscovered time and time again. Indeed, it's quite a recurring theme when you study history. It's why they say that historical revision is necessary to understand history, even if it's conflicting or even if the idea itself is exclusionary. The other interesting thing about science fiction novels, though, is they do tend to posit these unique ideas that we have of civilizations actually losing their knowledge, and the people within a civilization, or in this case, as in Orphans of the Sky, the actual crew of a ship, not only losing the understanding of the operations of the ship, but also the very existence of the ship. I can remember many discussions in class decades ago where many of the fellow students in my class could not understand how the individuals who were on the ship could be, to use their words, so stupid. Well, if you think about what could happen over generations, what kind of knowledge could be lost, depending on your environment? What if there was a knowledge that was very different concerning our current environment that we're living in right now, that was lost over time? And what if somebody else stepped in? And what if they gave an alternate explanation? Because somebody needed to have an explanation for the existence of all things. And just think on the idea that somebody stepped in and provided an alternate idea. And then as a result, because this was the prevailing idea and those in authority supported this idea, it became the reality. Now, granted, it's just a science fiction story. I'm not saying that's the reality that we're living in right now. But the idea and the plot is very intriguing because of the different dynamics of having different social groups. Indeed, the other thing that was revolutionary or new in Robert Heinlein's novel is the concept of mutants. And it should be noted that since he wrote this in the very early 1940s, in fact before the United States entry into World War II, even nuclear or atomic power, as it was referred to, was at that time still only a theory and had not been put into practical application, at least as we understand it from official publications. But that's the interesting thing about science fiction novels is, did they really predict upcoming technology, or were the authors simply on the cutting edge, such as when we did our exploration of Jules Verne? Jules Verne didn't suggest a generation ship, but perhaps he did. Perhaps it was in writings that weren't published. Or did Jules Verne even exist? All these potential realities may be possible. But whatever the ideas are that these science fiction authors shared with us, they could have simply come from their creative imagination. But where were they inspired? How were they inspired? The answer tends to be, well, they simply looked to earlier science fiction authors, or they looked to fantasy, they looked to fairy tale, and they tried to combine them or amalgamate them. There's also a great terror that tends to appear in science fiction novels, and yet we oftentimes see this terror existing in our collective conscience. There's no shortage of apocalyptic science fiction material that's been pushed on the mainstream. Indeed, you can find many of the most popular fictional stories involve an apocalyptic account of some sort. So while it's popular, it also results in a societal-wide fear, a fear of the loss or the fall of civilization. Is that because there really was a loss of civilization? Well, the mainstream will corroborate this by saying that yes, Rome fell, there were other civilizations that fell. Although they, again, indicate that it's a very minimalized event and it's not necessarily something that we should take seriously because of the fact that it was already a corrupt civilization, it practiced forced labor, and it needed to fall. It needed to fall so the world could revolutionize its society and become a much better place after hundreds of years of feudalism and other interesting forms of government. At least that's what the mainstream will tell us. But we can find no shortage of creative ideas, and whether it's on the extraordinary technological advancements or the very terrifying descents of what society or even the horror of technology could offer us. It's certain to say that H.G. Wells believed that technology was the answer to all of life's problems, and if you want to see how far he took that idea, watch the 1936 film Things to Come, which H.G. Wells had an inordinate amount of influence as the writer. He essentially had total creative control over the film. And let's move on from science fiction to another exploration of War of the Worlds, going to H.G. Wells' Invaders from Other Lands. We're not going to explore H.G. Wells' original work, though. We've covered it before. We are going to examine, though, a different account of it, which is War of the Worlds, the 1980s TV series. Now, to understand the TV series, you actually have to go back to the 1950s film. War of the Worlds in the early 1950s was a science fiction film that basically updated and evolved the story a little bit that H.G. Wells had told, and supposedly involved an invasion from extraterrestrials that were from Mars. Although it should be noted that the 1950s film was a lot more ambiguous and ambivalent about the actual origin of the invaders. Well, this continuity, at least the story in the 1950s film, the invaders fell victim to the bacteria that was present on Earth, or the land that we reside on, and they didn't die, but they were simply in a deep sleep. And the government then contained all of these invaders, these aliens, whatever you want to call them, in isolated compounds, and also seized their technology and stored it as well. And everyone just seemed to forget that it all happened. Again, another idea of this mass amnesia of a population forgetting a very cataclysmic event. And the interesting thing about the TV show, which initially aired in 1988-89 in the first season, they talked about how the population had completely forgotten about this very overt invasion, which had threatened the very existence of humanity. Yet the governments of the land at that time managed to hide away all these aliens in 55-gallon drums and store all of their remaining technology in various sites and secure military installations. The TV series was very horrifying in its own respect, and despite the fact that they had a very limited budget, they managed to make a lot of creative ideas and choices that made the aliens quite frightening. For example, once the aliens start to wake up, they had the ability to take over human bodies and possess humans. There was a problem, though, because the aliens needed to constantly bathe themselves with radiation so they wouldn't fall victim to the bacteria, which had caused them to fall into a hibernation. This was the official plot explanation for why the alien invasion in the 1950s was unsuccessful and why they revived in the late 1980s, according to the show's continuity. Many of the plots of the first season of the show dealt with the aliens using very unique methods of subterfuge to try to undermine the humans. And indeed, the governments of humanity do not take the alien threat very seriously. What we understand in the plot is that the aliens are preparing the way for a second wave, a larger invasion from their homeland or home planet. It's oddly enough ambivalent as well. There are some individuals, though, such as the members of the National Guard pictured here in this particular episode, who do have a memory of the original alien attack. And they even tie it back into the original Orson Welles broadcast of War of the Worlds in the 1930s. So many interesting and intriguing ideas in the first season of this show. And if you watch it now, some people say that it has a little bit of a repetitive nature, and while this may be true, it really gave you the impression of this existential terror that was also operating beneath the waves, in a way that they weren't readily apparent. For example, one of the plots that the aliens attempted is they would take over the bodies of various EMTs, emergency medical services, and then they would use those to collect humans for further experimentation. A very terrifying idea, and also the show making use of its limited budget to present something that the aliens were constantly a threat. The fact that the Blackwood team, which was merely a team of 4 regular humans, and they were sponsored by the government trying to dissuade and disrupt these aliens' activities, and yet they were minimally resourced. There was something that felt very oddly real and terrifying about this story, perhaps because of the fact that the limited budget was actually used as a strength to make this TV series feel a lot more realistic. There was another episode where the aliens, who always operate in threes, and their command group was called the Advocacy, and this was a group of 3 aliens. One of them fell sick, and they lost their ability to make decisions. So there were some very interesting rules that were established about the aliens and indeed this world that they lived in the first season. Well, efforts were made where the aliens actually had to seize human brains and then use them with some interesting technology to heal the 3rd alien of the Advocacy, restoring them to a full functionality. The series had a lot of many different elements of terror, and it had a thriller ending towards the end of the first season, where it seemed as though there was an entirely different group of aliens, or creatures from another land, however you want to think of it, that were going to threaten the original aliens. And yet they had malevolent purposes as well, as they simply desired to destroy humanity or use humanity as a food source. And therefore they wanted to defeat the Mortaxans. The other recurring plot element is the aliens attempting to recapture or re-implement the technology that they had lost in the 1950s with the ray guns that they had on their mantis or their tripod walkers, although they flew in the film version, and use them to overwhelm humanity. I think one of the reasons that this TV show, which unfortunately was lost in the second season, it did make it to the second season, but they changed out the producer and the creative team, and the second season just wasn't the same as the first season. It had some interesting ideas and is even credited as being an element of the genre of cyberpunk. But unfortunately, it lost a lot of the elements of existential terror and the subterfuge in the first season. It did depict the interesting decay and collapse of human society, possibly because of the war, although for reasons unknown or unstated. Many of the interesting plot elements that had been recurring throughout the first season were dropped into the second season, and many of the popular characters, such as Colonel Paul Ironhorse, didn't survive to the second season. And so as a result, the show lost a lot of the fan interest and was quietly pulled out after the second season. But I think one of the reasons why this was a popular show and why it's still well remembered to this day is it shows the efforts of just regular people to try to stop the efforts of some sort of invading existential force, and it contained a lot of interesting ideas. It also made a wondrous use of its limited budget by constantly making the stories feel real, as though this was something that could happen right in front of you. And there was never any shortage of terrorizing elements of the aliens. There's also the fact that, for television standards at the time, it tended to push the limits of violence and terror that was shown on TV at that time. Of course, it would be considered very mundane to viewers in this particular day, as standards constantly change. But it's something to keep in mind with how the perception of violence and terror has changed over time. It's also interesting to note that many of the tactics that the aliens used would be considered tactics that would be found abhorrent by what we consider as modern terrorist organizations to this day. So many different interesting ideas, and unfortunately this show was scrapped in the second season, where one of the wonderful plot ideas of having multiple alien civilizations that were competing for Earth to use as natural resources was simply scrapped, and we went back to the original aliens. And then we overlapped the idea of human civilization collapsing while it was happening at the same time. Perhaps the best thing I can say for the second season of War of the Worlds is it did give us an early look at Adrian Paul. And Adrian Paul pretty much improves anything that he's in, and I would argue that he's the entire reason that Highlander the series was as successful, or in that fact successful at all, because of his presence. But we'll move on from War of the Worlds and look at Mass Amnesia, a fresh canvas for new accounts. The salient mystery of Dark Ages sets the stage for mass amnesia. People living in vigorous cultures typically treasure those cultures and resist any threat to them. How and why can a people so totally discard the vital culture that it becomes vitally lost? And that's from Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs was an activist who actually tried to resist the efforts of urban renewal, because she looked at the concepts of urban renewal affecting the people that really lived in cities. And at the end of the day, she was trying to preserve old world structures and buildings, and indeed, she did succeed in many cases. Although at the time she was derided because she was a woman who was trying to stand up against social progress. We look at other examples of mass amnesia, such as in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, where we see an example of what may be a cargo cult with the survivors of the plane flown by Captain Walker, a 747 that evacuated an Australian city before a nuclear strike, and the plane was ultimately brought down by a nuclear strike. We also compare and contrast how mass amnesia can occur within civilizations because of a loss of knowledge. Now, what ends up happening when you have a loss of knowledge, and let's say you completely lose what the official objective account was, you'll have others that'll step in, and they'll try to fill in the blanks of the account. They may be correct, they may not be correct. It's not to say that there's even an intentional effort, or the terrifying word conspiracy, to subvert what the objective account is. It can happen completely by accident. For example, these bones. How did these bones get here in this image? Where did they come from? Who were these people? Of course, we'll be told that science can use its methods and find out exactly how old the bones were, find out exactly what strata that they're located in. They can use a combination of many different scientific disciplines and tell us everything that we need to know about the bones and the society and the culture that they came from. And yet, if that's the case, then why do we even bother with written accounts? What's the point of using written accounts, whether they're tablets, whether they're cuneiform, whether they're scrolls, or whatever their origin is, to actually document our civilization and our society? Why don't we just use science in every single case? Because isn't science supposed to be unbiased and objective? Aren't these other disciplines supposed to give us a perfect example of what our civilization or our society really was? And yet we oftentimes use a mix. For example, Mary Beard, the wondrous historian who could write incredible papers. And I will admit, Mary Beard is an exceptional communicator, probably one of the very best communicators you will ever come across, whether it's in the written word, and she's also a wonderful orator. And her field of expertise is antiquity, or classical Rome. And then we also look at Carl Sagan, the former scientific contributor of this channel, and Carl Sagan knew everything about space and the cosmos. And he never even had to go to space or the cosmos, just like Mary Beard had no way to ever go to Rome of antiquity, or the classical period, because obviously it existed long before she was ever alive. So Mary Beard was reliant on the writings of others. She was reliant on the books and the commitment of the knowledge to paper, as Carl Sagan liked to say. And as a result, what if somebody along the way had changed something or altered something? I'm not saying anybody would do so intentionally, but it's not as though Mary Beard could go consult the Guardian of Forever and actually watch the proceedings of events in classical Rome to know what really happened or what really didn't happen. She's reliant on those writings and how accurately they were captured at the time, and not only captured at the time, but then transmitted through different civilizations, different cultures, and different governments, which current history tells us are corrupt. Unless you want to believe that Mary Beard jumped into the DeLorean and went back into time that way, and then she was able to verify what actually happened in Rome during these time frames that she studies, and knows exactly what Augustus was eating on that night when he ordered the response to the massacre of the 3 legions in Germania. Or maybe she actually had to use a Reliant Robin because she was actually in the UK. And, a Reliant Robin being a 3-wheeled car, when you turn it over, it actually has the effect of taking you back in time. It's more effective than a DeLorean. And all kidding aside, that's something we have to remember, though, is how exactly do these individuals, these wonderful intellectuals who gain information from the past. For example, if you're going to study Rome, this is an individual you come across, Tacitus. Tacitus supposedly wrote about many different accounts, to include the crucifixion of Christ, although it should be noted that Tacitus wasn't born until well after the crucifixion of Christ, so he wasn't even a first-hand account. And yet you'll see many statues that show Tacitus, and I guess you could say that this statue could be anybody. I mean, the fact that we've got a beard going on here, this could be a U.S. Civil War general just by basis of the beard alone. I don't know, if you add the Glasgow smile, you might have Tommy Flanagan, and you might even have James McAvey if you want to take the Scottish touch on the statue. And Cornelius Tacitus said Christ suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. Again, Tacitus did not witness these events firsthand. He was merely transmitting other events. And keep in mind, this was nearly 2,000 years ago. So that's something we have to remember, is that these accounts were captured and they were transmitted over different civilizations. We have to remember that we've had different institutions that have tracked the information. And whether it was Josephus, who we're told was a citizen of Judea and Jewish and ended up defecting to the Roman Empire. Yes, doesn't that seem odd? I guess he's kind of like Admiral Jarrock was in Star Trek The Next Generation. Very odd that a Romulan would ever want to defect. Yet we have that account, and supposedly he was a reliable historian of the Jewish wars that occurred during the time frame of the 100s. Isn't it also interesting that in Roman coinage we virtually never see a year? But perhaps they just didn't need it. If you have a likeness of the emperor on the coin, then you should be able to know what the year was, because we know beyond any shadow of a doubt what the reigns were. But again, it goes back into questioning the very history. How certain are we on its accuracy and its authenticity? 2,000 years is a long time. How many different civilizations and how many different times have we been told that we had to recover the records of Rome? And while we have very wondrous communicators such as Mary Beard and Carl Sagan, what could they really tell us? And that's why we question the records of civilization. Most of our studies center around the Reset War, the transition from what we call the Fourth Era to the Fifth Era, and that's because of the limitations that we have. The Foundation eras are quite frankly mythical or legendary to us. And keep in mind that even if we did have an accurate account, or what we thought was an accurate account, we have to remember that they passed through other civilizations. They passed through other caretakers, other recorders, other institutions who preserved the knowledge. How effectively did they preserve it? Or did they get it confused? Did they get it wrong? This is why we have to remember that even the objective study of history is very difficult. And also recall that in our 48 Laws of Power by author Robert Greene, he talks about the most important law being do not outshine your boss. Indeed, Galileo was known to name the moons of Jupiter after the most powerful family, the Medicis, at that time. And why did he do this? To gain their favor. Well, if the Medicis said there weren't going to be any planets, then would Galileo have not actually found any planets? Would he have altered his findings so he could fall into their favor? Who's to know and who's to say? But what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me for today's exploration of Tolkien, Tartaria, and the Old World. Or is it Middle-earth and Arda? Today we're going to be exploring the connections between the brilliant imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien and his original creations of Arda and Middle-earth. Everyone is well familiar with the Lord of the Rings movie series, and I believe that's the most profound example in popular culture where there's the greatest amounts of connections with J.R.R. Tolkien. But what can we say about the amazing history and world that this creative genius brought forth from his own mind? What are the connections with what he created and the old world? Was he talking about a fantasy land? Or was he really talking about something that he believed actually existed? The images that we have from the beautiful world he created, he called it Arda, or as the Middle Lands where most of the plot took place was called Middle-earth. This is the Halls of Mandos, and this is in Valinor, a land that was part of Arda but would eventually be beyond the reach of human beings in the story. A beautiful hall where the souls of the dead would go to wait for the final battle. Here, an amazing depiction of Thorondor, Lord of the Eagles, fighting in Calagon, the greatest of the dragons made by the Dark Lord Morgoth, during the War of Wrath in the First Age. Here, the Dark Lord Morgoth, pictured with Ungoliant the spider, as they open up the trees of light to suck their energy and darken the world again. And both Dark Lords, the major antagonists of Tolkien stories, with Morgoth, the greatest Dark Lord of all, pictured on the left of the Ainur, and Sauron, featured in the Lord of the Rings movies, and a Maiar spirit, the same kind of spirit that the wizard Gandalf was, also in the movies. Who was J.R.R. Tolkien? Well, I'll confess to you that for the longest time, when I first read the Lord of the Rings books when I was a boy, I mispronounced the name like many other people. I thought it was J.R.R. Tolkien. His full name is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, not Tolkien. Was an English writer and philologist. He lived from 3 January 1892 to 2 September 1973. So on the tail end of the 19th century, a questionable time period in our research. He was the author of the high fantasy works The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and he had many more creative inspirations to his credit. From 1925 to 1945, Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a Fellow of Pembroke College, both at the University of Oxford. He then moved within the same university to become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Merton College, and held these positions from 1945 until his retirement in 1959. He was a close friend of C.S. Lewis, a co-member of the informal literary discussion group The Inklings. He was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II on 28 March 1972. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher published a series of works based on his father's extensive notes and unpublished manuscripts, including the Silmarillion. These, together with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, form a connected body of tales, poems, fictional histories, invented languages, and literary essays about a fantasy world called Arda, and within it, Middle-earth. Between 1951 and 1955, Tolkien applied the term legendarium to the larger part of these writings. And in closing, Tolkien really brought about to popular culture the concept of high fantasy. But was this just high fantasy? Or was there a lot more that came from the brilliant mind of this remarkable man? Someone whose literary works rival the greatest literary works in all of the human languages. Now, why do we give such accolades to Tolkien? Well, let's look at his upbringing a little bit. This is the Birmingham Oratory, where Tolkien was a parishioner and altar boy. Very remarkable building, and in the United Kingdom, we see that this is yet another old world building. We tend not to focus as many explorations on Europe or the United Kingdom because the official narrative we're given tells us that these lands have been settled and built upon for hundreds of years, so one would think it makes sense. But it's still worthy of great explorations, and this building is no exception. We have the remarkable dome rotunda, we have the columns that we see in so many old world constructions. No doubt that when Tolkien saw this with his open mind, he questioned it. He wondered, how was it such a building could exist? What did it really tell him, and what did it inspire within him? And for the record, I have the greatest amount of respect for J.R.R. Tolkien and his works, and this entire video will be a tribute to that. I also want to share with viewers that I do have a little bit of a confirmation bias, because Tolkien books were the very first books that I read that were really high fantasy. So I'm acknowledging that as we go forward in this exploration. Here we have the Free Grammar School where Tolkien was a pupil, and then on the right a picture of his family. It's not known to most that the Tolkien name actually emanates from Prussia, or what would later be East Germany, in the town of Königsberg. It's worth noting that Königsberg Castle, before World War I, pictured on the left here, another amazing old world building with all the remarkable telltale signs that we see. Even the picture of this road with the tracks, and then of course we have the horse-pulled trolley vehicle, something else we see a lot. This castle was destroyed on Brezhnev's orders. Interesting that it lasted until 1969, since this castle was supposedly a headquarters of the Teutonic Knights, a military order that Russia sees as one of its greatest antagonists in history, and Russia's struggle against the Teutonic Order is one of their greatest aspects of national identity. And yet, this wasn't destroyed until 1969. Well, I guess Joseph Stalin was too busy outmaneuvering the United States, despite the fact the United States was a nuclear-armed nation, and his nation was not nuclear-armed, and yet he was able to achieve many policy victories. Discussion for another time. On the right, you see the 14th century Königsberg Cathedral, another amazing, beautiful, old-world building. Now, we don't focus as many explorations yet on Europe, but they're not any less worthy of our depth and attention, and we'll be getting to them. And I just find it interesting that the origin of Tolkien's family comes from an area that is something that we've examined in explorations before, and it was one of my very early videos on the channel when we showed the Book of Germany and what was being displayed to American service members after World War II. Now let's consider Tolkien's war service, because this is really something that defined him. We know that Tolkien served in World War I after he was married, and we'll just read a little excerpt about what kind of person Tolkien really was. On 5 June 1916, Tolkien boarded a troop transport for an overnight voyage to Calais. Like other soldiers arriving for the first time, he was sent to the British Expeditionary Forces base depot at Etaples. On 7 June, he was informed that he had been assigned as a signals officer to the 11th Service Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. The battalion was part of the 74th Brigade 25th Division. While waiting to be summoned to his unit, Tolkien sank into boredom. To pass the time, he composed a poem titled The Lonely Isle. The guy was always creative, no matter what he was doing, which was inspired by his feelings during the sea crossing to Calais. To evade the British Army's postal censorship, yes, good old censorship, he developed a code of dots by which Edith, that's his wife, could track his movements. He left Etaples on 27 June 1916 and joined his battalion in Rumpere near Amiens. He found himself commanding enlisted men who were drawn mainly from the mining, milling, and weaving towns of Lancashire. According to John Garth, he felt an affinity for these working-class men, but military protocol prohibited friendships with other ranks. Instead, he was required to take charge of them, discipline them, train them, and probably censor their letters. If possible, he was supposed to inspire their love and loyalty. Tolkien later lamented, "The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." So I share this excerpt because I think it's a great overview of what kind of person J.R.R. Tolkien truly was at heart. Battle of the Somme. He arrived at the Somme in early July 1916. In between terms behind the lines at Bozencourt, he participated in the assaults on the Schwaben Redoubt and Leipzig salient. Tolkien's time in combat was a terrible stress for Edith, who feared that every knock on the door might carry news of her husband's death. Edith could track her husband's movements on a map of the Western Front. So I think we see the origin of where Tolkien got this amazing ability to make maps, and maps are something you always find with any Lord of the Rings book. The Reverend Mervyn S. Evers, Anglican chaplain to the Lancashire Fusiliers, recorded that Tolkien and his fellow officers were eaten by hordes of lice, which found the medical officer's ointment merely a kind of ars d'oeuvre, and the little beggars went at their feast with renewed vigor. It does not sound like a pleasant experience. On 27 October 1916, his battalion attacked Regina Trench. Tolkien contracted trench fever, a disease carried by lice. He was invalided to England on 8 November 1916. So quite an experience, and we see someone who has a remarkable sympathy for human beings and did not enjoy the concept of being an officer or a leader. And there's a saying that many officers' primary job in military forces across the world is to get their soldiers killed. Now, this might not be a popular saying, but it is something that you hear, especially when you discuss things with enlisted personnel. And I'll be honest, I've even had officers in certain NATO armies tell me flat out that their job is to get soldiers killed. Quite a remarkable concept, and interesting that they were open about that. I don't know if they were being serious or if they were just joking with me, but you can certainly see for yourself what's happened in the results. Nevertheless, this shows how Tolkien was formed as an individual when he was younger and the experience in the Great War. Now let's transition over to the world that Tolkien envisioned. Tolkien meant Arda, which was what he called his fantasy world, to be our own green and solid earth, seen here in the Baltistan Mountains at some quite remote epoch in the past. So it's stated in many different places that Tolkien meant Arda to be our earth, our land in the distant past. He meant that and he intended it. And now let's look at the world that he envisioned. The early world of Arda. He saw it on a plane or a disc, and it was lit initially in the First Age or in the times before the First Age, the way that he organized the timelines or eras in his world. The two lamps of Arda, which were the only lamps that initially lit the land, and this is all there was. And then as time progressed, once the lamps were destroyed by the evil forces of Morgoth, and if you're not familiar with the history, this comes from the Silmarillion, which was the amazing collection of tales and legendarium that Tolkien worked on for years to completely outline all the legends and all the myths to understand the origin of this world. It's quite remarkable, and it is a huge amount of information. But following the destruction of the lamps, the world was lit by the two trees of the Valinor, and the land was divided by a sea. And you have Middle-earth, and that's the name. Middle-earth comes from the fact that it's actually in the middle of the disc-shaped existence, or the land. And Aman, or Valinor, which was where the gods, or the Valar, resided. And it was lit by two trees, and you saw a picture of what happened to those two trees earlier, where the Dark Lord Morgoth allowed the spider Ungoliant to suck the life from both trees, killing them and darkening the world again. Then the Valar brought about the moon and the sun, or should I say Eru, who is what Tolkien calls the god of Arda, or his name for god of Arda. And the moon and sun orbit the world in Middle-earth, lighting it at all times, and preventing Morgoth from darkening the world again, with light during the day and light at night. Very interesting myth, and you can say that it's inspired from many of the other myths that come from Anglo-Saxon or Germanic tribes or whatever from the Western world. And yet there's so many connections all across our land and from many different cultures, and many of these myths actually have so much similarity to them, it's not even funny. And now let's look at how Arda changed, how it went from being a flat world of the Second Age to the round world of the Third Age. These are the most interesting concepts that Tolkien presented us, because Middle-earth in the Second Age was the flat disk land, and the great kingdom of Numenor. Numenor was a kingdom of men who were friends of the elves, and Tolkien has his various species that he uses in Middle-earth, and the main species include elves, which are wisest and fairest of the races. It includes men or human beings who are not as wise and as fair as the elves, and yet they have the most potential for the afterlife. And then the dwarves. And it's a very remarkable amalgamation of societies, and sometimes they have their own conflicts, especially in The Hobbit, and many times they fight in alliances against the dark forces that are led either by Morgoth in the First Age or Sauron in the Second, Third Age. Numenor was the great kingdom of human beings, and you can see it as an analogy to Atlantis. And when this kingdom was corrupted by the influences of Sauron, and they tried to sail to Valinor to attack the land of the gods, Numenor sunk in an amazing disaster, much as Atlantis is said to have done. And then the world was changed. And the whole point of the world being changed was to prevent human beings and the creatures that still resided on it from reaching the land of the Valinor. Nevertheless, the elves still had a gateway, a capability to sail from a world that was sealed off to the land of the Valinor. And you even see this at the end of The Lord of the Rings and The Return of the King, when the elves depart and they take Frodo with them. And Bilbo as well, the two main Hobbit characters. If you're not familiar with the movies, I can certainly recommend them. But in any event, these concepts are remarkable because of the fact that it shows a mentality for how the shape of the land can be changed, for how access from one land to the other could possibly function. Could Tolkien have been referring to the ways that our world or our lands have been changed? Was he inspired by something that was a little more realistic and a little more remarkable? It's hard to say, and yet we can't ignore the many connections. And there are so many connections from what Tolkien imagined in his world and the things that we explore in our world and the things that we observe, and not just in our own account of history that we're given, but also in so many other forms of myth. There are many connections, and it applies to all societies and all cultures across the land. And then finally, what was Tolkien saying about the Third Age to the Sixth and the Seventh Age? He believed that the other races, and there were more, I didn't mention them all, there were Ents and there were Hobbits. Didn't mention the Ents, they were the gigantic tree creatures. They dwindle and disappear, the continents break up and rearrange, and we could be in the Sixth or Seventh Age. And you see that this concept of ages matches many of the theories that we have of eras or how the world could have progressed. And it's very clear that Tolkien believed that he was really relating to us something more than just a fantasy tale. And of course, this will be dismissed by many people in the mainstream, but yet when you read Tolkien's work and you see the amount of detail into it, it's just astonishing. It's astonishing the amount of detail that went into creating this so-called fantasy world. And did you know that Tolkien created his own languages for Middle-earth and for Arda? High Elvish, a written language, all of it came from his mind. And I think that's just remarkable. And even if you don't believe in any connections from Tolkien and the Old World or the subsequent existence of a civilization that preceded ours that we refer to as Tartaria, you have to admit it's quite amazing that one individual was able to imagine an entire world, create an entire history for an entire world, and in addition to that, create languages, written languages with many variations on these languages. I find this unbelievably remarkable, and I think this should all prove to us that there is the capability to create the existence of other worlds and other lands just from our minds. Now, are they just written tales and they're just high fantasy? Or could they be something much more? I leave that question to you. Here's a map of Beleriand, which was lands featured in the First Age, and Beleriand was an amazing land, and it was where the elves that followed Morgoth after he stole the Cimmerals from Valinor settled and developed their initial kingdoms. And I mention it because Beleriand was sunk below the ocean and the land was changed after the First Age. A reference to resets. And there were many resets in Tolkien's world, and that's how he divided up the ages. You have the breaking of Beleriand, you have the sinking of Numenor, you have the consistent and constant changing of the lands with each different age, just as we say for each different era in our own theories. And I go back to the image of the Tower of Babel because that is something that's featured in many mythologies, and yet it's a significant connection point because it also refers to the story of languages and how human beings were once stated to have spoken the same language and have an understanding. Even if they had different cultures, even if they had their own local customs and traditions, there was a time that they worked together and they understood each other. Are there connections between this and the world that Tolkien imagined? I believe that there are, but maybe it's just a fantasy, and I could well be wrong. But there's too many connections to simply ignore. And finally, the concept of imagination and creativity, the greatest attributes, I think, to any human being. Where did this whole concept of the Ultima Tower come from? Why would we be conceptualizing things that are supposedly beyond our ability to construct or architect? And this is not the only building. There are many great buildings that have been conceptualized, and we'll be talking about them in a subsequent video. But I think it relates to Tolkien and some of the amazing structures that he envisioned in his stories of Arda, or Middle-earth. And it all falls back into the 5 eras, and you'll find many myths and many aspects dividing up the epochs of time, ages, the eras, whatever we want to call them. And that's something that I use as a framing device in the research that I do on this channel, because it's one way to visualize what may have happened in the past, what really happened in the past. Is this necessarily correct? No. Do I consider this a living document that can change, and will I likely change it if evidence or what we have as significant evidence may change when the resets occurred or what we understand of the past? Absolutely, because this is research and this is exploration that we're doing. And things will always change as we learn more. Perceptions may change. So that's why it's important to keep an open mind and not be settled into one simple belief system just because it's comfortable for us. One of the concepts that Tolkien had that was reflected in both our own mythology is the decline of longevity of men or human beings. And in his world, there was once a time when human beings lived much longer, especially those who were considered the elf friends. And there's a deleted line in the film The Two Towers where we find out that Aragorn, or Strider, is actually 87 years old. And that's because he's one of the Dunedain, gifted with long life. And it matches many of the things that we see in our own mythological works, or it could be an accurate historical tale. It depends on your perception. The decline of the longevity of human beings in the Bible, when we said that individuals from times in the past lived much longer, 800 to 1,000 years, and as time went on, their lifespans declined. And yet we're told that that just doesn't apply. That's just a silly myth, and it's not real. But you really have to wonder because it appears in many different locations. Finally, let's talk about the nature of the existence of the orcs. The orcs, the legend in Tolkien's Arda, came from the elves. The elves said to be the wisest and fairest of beings, but many elves, after their awakening or their creation by Eru, were captured by the Dark Lord Morgoth. They were taken underground, and they were tortured and mutilated until they became the orcs, as depicted here. Are there races and are there legends of species that may have been similar, or human beings who were tortured, mutilated, or even just changed through processes we can't possibly understand? We have many hints and clues throughout our literature and our existing, what we're told are fantasy books. But is this fantasy? There are many other explorers and many other examples that have looked at expecting to encounter things such as blimmies, which are these creatures that don't really have heads and their faces are in their chests. It sounds strange and it sounds bizarre and otherworldly. And yet, could there be something more to it? I think it's a possibility we have to consider. And we know for a fact that our modern governments do not have any reluctance in terms of testing things on human beings and what they do. So it's something important to keep in mind what may have happened in the past with the corruption of previous existing civilizations and societies. What were they really willing to try on their human beings, and how did they change them? And for the record, I do not believe that this is the worst way that human beings can be corrupted. It's terrible, there's no doubt about it. But I do believe that there are worse ways that human beings can be corrupted. What The works of J.R.R. Tolkien reflect the high fantasy concept and world building that, to this day, continues to inspire new authors as they seek to embark on fantasy. We did explore the sword and sorcery element of it when we looked at Conan, and now we look at Tolkien's work. J.R.R. Tolkien seemed to understand the very concept of cycles, and indeed, it was written into his work. Today we explore his abandoned work, The New Shadow.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
The New Shadow could be considered Tolkien's final warning to the world and to the land. He seemed to have an understanding of the nature of humanity, and The New Shadow was a book that he had started working on but eventually abandoned. But in order to understand the dynamics of The New Shadow, how it affected Tolkien, and what he may have been warning to the public, we have to examine the rest of his works, and we have to go back and review what Tolkien's world really was all about. Tolkien seemed to have the vision of a great land that existed in the distant past, and a lot of people do allude to it as being high fantasy, and indeed, he's considered the very father of high fantasy. And what exactly is high fantasy? High fantasy reflects to the fantasy works in which you have a world, or a fantasy world, in which the very stake or the survival of that world is the main plot point of the novel, as compared to, say, sword and sorcery, where you have a wonderful fantasy world that's been developed, but the very fate of the world is not necessarily at stake by the events of the novel or the works. And these are some of the elements that make Tolkien's work so memorable and so appreciated. It feels as though he had the ability to weave fine legend and myth into something that felt a lot more real. And you can find this in all the works, whether you're looking at The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or any of the other works that Tolkien had composed over time. You can see that many of the lands that he looked at were inspired by the lands that still exist to this day. He even stated that Arda, or his world, was meant to be our own green and solid earth. And it was these very lands that inspired the works that he had, and that's where these great tales took place. But perhaps the most interesting thing in our consideration of Tolkien is just how rich and developed and how much depth there was in all the elements of his land, in the very land of Arda. He had an entire origin story that goes all the way back to the beginning. An entire origin of spiritual beings that managed to create a world through the simple fabrication of what they referred to as music. And then eventually the development of this entire world and how it evolved and changed over time. Or perhaps you could just say how it changed over time. The original origin of the different species that inhabited this incredible world, and how the lands were altered due to the events that occurred. And there was something about these works that really inspired our imaginations, and you could see with the very concept of Middle-earth, and it should be noted that Middle-earth was something that developed over time, and it referred to different lands and different divisions of lands. And that's something that relates back to all the research that we do with our alternative research when we look at how the very nature of the land that we exist on may have changed over time. Now, many people believe that the land has never changed, and there was never a time where it reflected what we see in Tolkien's depiction of Middle-earth or his description of Arda. But what if there is actually a connection? What if somehow in some way Tolkien really understood exactly what had transpired in our distant past? Indeed, one of the suppositions that this channel has made in the distant past when it looked at the works of Tolkien before is that perhaps Tolkien was actually recounting events that had occurred historically. Now, while that may seem absurd to some, we have to look at our own given history, and we have a lot of confidence that everything that we're told happened exactly as we are told. And we do acknowledge that it is possible that everything happened as we are told. But how could it be so accurate if we take everything at face value? Indeed, there is no one alive right now today anywhere in the land who had first-hand witness to the events that occurred in 1899. That really wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, and yet when we look at the origins and the myths that are interwoven within our current society, we have to consider what Tolkien was bringing about and describing in detail. What if there are other works or there are other origin stories that we could actually look at that gives us an entirely different account of the development of our land? Indeed, that's the most interesting element of looking at Tolkien's work, is how the land changed over time. Originally, he referred to a flat world, he referred to the land being lit by 2 trees, and then finally a sun and the moon being established. And indeed, an actual account of a land before the existence of a sun and a moon. And yet we can also find, allegedly, myths and legends that state that there was a time in our own land before the moon. And could there have even been a time before the sun, which we don't write about or talk about? Now, you have to be patient when you're looking at these examinations of Tolkien, because oftentimes we feel that we know exactly what the truth is. That we know that the given historical account must be true. There is no questioning it, and it is unimpeachable. There is no way that you could possibly consider that anything else happened beyond what you're told. And to do so will result in you being castigated, or someone else saying that they know exactly what's best for you. At the end of the day, we all have to decide exactly what it is that we believe. And perhaps the mainstream account is more comfortable for us to believe. Perhaps it makes more sense that it's always just been a floaty ball going around through space, and that's all it really is. But yet Tolkien seemed to look at all the different perspectives and had them incorporated into his work. And that's interesting, that he had the round world, he had the flat world, and he even had detached lands, the Undying Lands, that could only be reached by a single route, or the straight road as it were called. And the exact mentality or the exact science behind that, however you want to state it, was never exactly clear. And yet somehow the elves seem to have an inherent knowledge, or they were simply chosen to be able to access this particular area. And it's looking in the dynamics of Tolkien's world that we can see many parallels for what may be existing in our world. Think of all the different accounts that we have of hidden lands that suddenly appear, disappearing islands, certain areas across the land where there may be access to certain points, or even the reference of certain areas of the land becoming timeless voids at certain areas and certain times. This is what truly inspires the interest about the works of Tolkien, because these are the works that actually give us different sorts of explanations and various backgrounds for how the actual nature of our true land may be. Now, of course, many people are very emotional about what they view as the shape of the land, and it's hard to say who's right or who's wrong. Of course, we're given no shortage of assurances that we know exactly what's right, and it's quite simple that the shape of the land is well known, and it's an incontrovertible fact. And if you want to embrace it as an incontrovertible fact, you're welcome to. But it's interesting to look at the other possibilities and to also consider the element of how this all developed in Tolkien's work. Was he really describing to us an actual historical account? Because indeed, in his later works and the ephemeral materials, it's stated that in the 6th or 7th age, that's really our modern land, our current time frame. And is it possible that what Tolkien was writing about was indeed a historical account of what really happened? That perhaps he had access to other files, other scrolls, other works that had been hidden from other elements of society. And whether it was his place, his affiliation with certain groups that had given him access to this, or perhaps he had some sort of ability to not only have the access, but to also draw on these collective memories. It's hard to say for sure, but it is noted that Tolkien constructed several languages, and when we consider the concept of languages and how it plays into our biblical accounts and the other origin stories that we have across many cultures and religions in the land, we can't ignore the fact that it's stated that at one time humans all spoke the same language. And yet there seem to be other accounts that state that there was some sort of calamity that occurred or event, and this caused human beings to speak different languages and suddenly no longer to understand one another. Indeed, we can look and study and see how language is altered every day. Even within people who speak the same language, there's many different dialects, many different pronunciations, and even these little details are the amount of a lot of emotional consternation, oftentimes preventing us from looking at things objectively because we're more concerned about adhering to certain details. Looking at the account, though, of how Tolkien's world developed, when we look at the First Age, we have an account of a landmass that had once existed, and a people who had gone through many great trials and tribulations. Indeed, the origin story of the elves, or an entirely different species who may have existed in the distant past. Of course, now this would be ridiculed as something that's completely impossible, and yet you're also supposed to accept without question that dinosaurs existed 60 million years ago. So, I suppose it just depends on your perspective and what you really want to believe is objective information. And again, it should be noted that, of course, the scientists, the archaeologists, the paleontologists could be correct in what they're telling us. It just seems as though the likelihood of it becomes more and more questionable with the fact that the account is often altered. even considering the original account of the Tower of Babel, where we have the one civilization who spoke one language that was trying to achieve something architecturally, where they had a structure that reached the very sky. Now, of course, it's often just referred to as the tower in the city, but perhaps it was referring to actual magnificent and colossal structures that tried to reach the very sky. And was Tolkien referencing these in some of the incredible works and the wondrous cities that he wrote about within his works of Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion? The concept and the possibility of large structures and edifices that could even match the height of mountains or even the width is something that is very compelling. And it is noted that in Tolkien's work he wrote about things such as great lamps that lit the entire land or wondrous temples and cities that crossed the entire lands. The other thing that he also focused on was the cyclic nature of civilizations and the way that the life forms that inhabited or made up these civilizations existed. Tolkien seemed to have an understanding of how certain people were determined to exist in a certain way, and yet he also looked at the cyclic nature. And indeed, it was actually the works of Tolkien in his ages that inspired the original Five Eras theory on this channel, in addition to the mentality of the Five Ages from the Greek classical ages. But the other thing that's always fascinated me, though, looking at how Tolkien relates into inspiring the Five Eras theory, is the concept of the cyclical nature. The fact that civilizations will rise and they'll fall. There are some people that will argue that civilizations don't necessarily ever fall, they just simply change, and then their identity changes, and then they rise again. And then, of course, they go through a period of trials and tribulations. And indeed, that's what the mainstream history seems to tell us, that Rome never really fell exactly, it just transformed once it had descended into a state which it could never recover from. Although we also look at the stated accounts of the decline of the longevity of humanity. We look at the fact that human beings in certain religious accounts were stated to live far longer in the distant past. Oddly enough, this happens to be a parallel within Tolkien's work about how the longevity of human beings was much greater in the distant past than it is in the present. And so once again, this is another element or another idea that seems to reflect what we have in our research. The concept that humanity in the past had many greater capabilities. They had greater physical capabilities. Now, could this have also extended to an entirely different physical stature beyond our imagination? Absolutely. But even just looking at the aspect of how ages and longevity has changed over time, that in and of itself is very compelling, along with the knowledge that may have been gained or lost. Consider that if you had an entire civilization of individuals that lived far longer, what could they have been capable of? There's also the recurring theme of how evil does not actually create in Tolkien's works. It merely corrupts that which already exists. When we look at the very existence of the antagonist species used by the Dark Lords in Tolkien's work, the orcs, the origin story of the orcs is that they were actually tortured and mutilated after they were captured by the Dark Lord, when they were in their original form of being elves. And we also look at the other accounts that we have within our own history that may or may not be true with other unique life forms, the concepts of blimmies and the observations that we have that show us that there were other concepts of life that may have been changed or corrupted in ways that we don't completely understand. Indeed, many of the references towards the perversion of alchemical processes seems to be directed towards achieving this end, the very change of life forms into something that we don't recognize. And it's on this note that we now look at Tolkien's unfinished work, or his final warning, the work called The New Shadow. The New Shadow was a work that Tolkien had abandoned, and we're going to look and examine the reasons for why he abandoned this work. Now, there is an ephemeral material that was composed by Christopher Tolkien, or at least edited, that talked about the return of the Shadow. Christopher Tolkien continuing the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. What's interesting about looking at the example of A New Shadow is we have the account of what had happened after evil was defeated. And if you're not familiar with the Lord of the Rings story, you know that it ended with the Dark Lord Sauron being defeated and the resurgence of the Kingdom of Gondor, led by Aragorn and his descendants. What The New Shadow reflects on is what happens after humanity, or mankind as Tolkien referred to it as, grew corrupted over time. What happened when there was no longer the presence of evil and challenge? And indeed, the very theme and the plot of The New Shadow focuses on how people once again return to not understanding what exactly was achieved in the distant past, and not understanding the true threat of the very evil in their midst. We understand that in the Fourth Age, according to Tolkien's work, that with the defeat of Sauron, that people began to grow idle. And then there's even the account of an old warrior who had actually survived and served in the Third Age with the armies of Gondor. And he suddenly saw some troubling developments that were going on within the kingdom of Gondor after the defeat of Sauron. Indeed, Tolkien even relates that the descendants of Aragorn had actually become decadent themselves. And only the few soldiers who had served and survived from the Third Age actually knew what the presence of evil really was, and what kind of threat it would pose, not just to humanity, but to all of the free beings of Middle-earth. And this was perhaps the darkest element of Tolkien's work, The New Shadow, that it was the doom of humanity to forget what threats may have posed, and what kind of darkness existed within inside each individual. Because the more threatening part is, it's learned that there are cults that develop within Gondor, and these cults worship the old beings of the orcs, and worship the Dark Lord even. There seems to be a series of new religions that have suddenly developed, and many people are unaware of the threat that they pose. And this was one of the main reasons that Tolkien stated that this work was very dark, and that he decided to abandon it, because ultimately it was too dark for him to realize that there was an inevitable reality within the individual of humanity. He realized that there seemed to be an inevitable cycle of idleness, followed by apathy, in which case the new civilization would fall in the same way that the previous civilization had done before. And if you step far enough back, you can see the parallels between the eventual rise and fall of Gondor, and then the rise of Gondor again, and then how the once legendary kingdom or civilization of humanity, Numenor, had fallen in the distant past at the end of the Second Age. And perhaps that's what Tolkien was really getting at when he looked at some of these examples of how beings could be corrupted. He wasn't just talking about the orcs or the forces of the Dark Lord, he was ultimately talking about all creatures, although he was really focused more on humanity being more susceptible to this cycle. And indeed, it's a recurring theme in all of his works. That was really what The New Shadow had alluded to, the fact that there was a threat that had never really gone away, that the real threat was the idleness and the apathy of humanity, that people would lose their faith within themselves and ultimately lose their individuality, succumbing to the desires of temptation and the idleness of what was presented by peace. People would eventually be bored by prosperity and peace, and indeed the very children themselves would turn to cults that ended up worshiping the orcs, or ended up commemorating the great achievements of the Dark Lord. Do we see a parallel to that in our current civilization? Is it so obvious that we would have evil that is just stated to be evil, but then at the same time we would say it's really not so evil? It's really a different perception. What's the real truth behind things? Are we to find truth in others, or do we find truth within ourselves? As it seems, the one thing that Tolkien was well aware of was that the concept for evil to succeed was involved with the focus on constant external affairs, and not really knowing oneself. Indeed, when you look at the strength of characters of the Tolkien heroes, you'll find that they were all well aware of their own weaknesses. Perhaps the most obvious example being Aragorn, being well aware of the weakness that laid within the hearts of humanity, and therefore he was able to resist it and ascend to something far better than had come before. And yet there always seems to be people who follow, who don't recall the legends or the challenges in the distant past. And therefore, we understand that with Tolkien's own life and his terrifying experiences in the trenches of World War I, that he had this example given to him firsthand every day. And if you ever read the novel or watch the film All Quiet on the Western Front, you get an idea of the cycle of civilizations, One of the themes within that novel that Tolkien no doubt lived in his own life is the fact that none of the soldiers really knew what they were fighting for. They would oftentimes debate it, and All Quiet on the Western Front is told from the German perspective. Although Tolkien fought with the Allies or the British, they all seem to have the same perspective. What were they really fighting for? What was really the intention behind the conflict? There was an example of the Christmas truce that occurred in World War I, where the soldiers from both sides had simply met together and celebrated, realizing that they were human beings and they all had a right to life. Of course, this was quickly shut down, and their commanders quickly had them fighting in the trenches again in no time. But it is an interesting element to consider when we look at the development of humanity and how civilizations actually operate. Is this really the ability for a civilization to exist where all individuals are cared for? Or is it simply our doom, our fate, that we're going to fall back to the animosities of superiority, the perceptions of superiority, that we have some cultures that are better than others, and that there are other nations that simply need to be destroyed or brought into line? Was all this stated in Tolkien's work, or did he believe that it was possible for an existence where all individuals, all cultures, were valued and understood, and that they could actually coexist? These are all very difficult and interesting thoughts to consider, but we're oftentimes lampooned or derided because we even want to consider that there may once have been a civilization where all people actually had the ability to prosper. And yet it did not always crush the individual. It existed in balance. These ideas are very threatening and even considered perverse to some people, because for many we're told that the real grandeur is in great achievement, that it's only really to be found in conflict and struggle and strife. And Tolkien knew this, given what he saw and witnessed in the trenches of World War I. We found ourselves in a very stagnant war, a war that involved mass human wave attacks against weaponry that was superior against the tactics at the time, and as a result there were extensive casualties. Yet from all of this, somehow Tolkien was able to contrive, or at least as we understand from the mainstream historical account, create a wondrous world that reflected some of the highest ideals of creativity and value from humanity. And it's within this that we see a fantasy land that may not be so fantastical as we might like to believe. That what Tolkien was really writing about was our distant past. That he had a great understanding of the individual human, and also how civilizations would rise and fall. Indeed, he seemed to have an understanding of different kinds of beings, perhaps beings that we would refer to as deities, whether they were deities of lightness or darkness, or more of a religious connotation. And indeed, many will simply say that Tolkien was inspired by the baselines of Christianity, and there are many parallels, and this is a very strong argument. But there seems to be another awareness in Tolkien's works that transcend this in many ways, where he understood that while one of the basic sayings was that evil does not create, it corrupts, it should be noted that we can oftentimes see the corruption of evil in what's already created. We can also see that one of the reasons he found the New Shadow to be such a dark work was that he saw the potential for the cycle, that many humans possibly couldn't break the cycle. And that was one of the main reasons, perhaps, why he did not continue with this sequel to The Lord of the Rings, The New Shadow, because he saw the darkness within it. And so it will only exist to this day as the idea of a novel that Tolkien did not finish. Ideas, though, that still exist as a warning that we have to be aware of what lies within our own hearts, that he understood that where all evil came from was ultimately within, that this was to be feared. But he also left us with, you can only come to the morning through the shadows. You have to experience it. You have to understand it. It's only then that you can really make the true transcendence, and that greater possibilities become something that are tangible. And so let's look at the ages of Arda compared to our 5 eras, and look at Tolkien's works. Within our understanding of the 5 eras, we posit that there were 4 hard resets that have completely changed our civilization. And that one of the themes behind these resets and the civilizations that existed, even the most recent being the Fourth Era, or the Tartarian Era, is that over time the people fell to corruption, that they had achieved wondrous marvels that we can only begin to imagine, and yet at the same time they also fell. We look at Tolkien's own timeline for the Ages of Arda, and oddly enough we find that it could fit quite well, especially within the foundation eras of our five eras theory. Now, this is all supposition, this is all theory, but it's important to remember that many of these ideas do match up, and there are a lot of parallels within them. Indeed, we look at how the very shape of the land changed within Tolkien's work. And one of the things that we seem to have lost is that there is an awareness that the shape of the land was perceived differently in the past by our ancestors. But what are your thoughts? Are there elements of new shadow that we still have to take for warning to this day? Is the real weakness within the individual the desire to fall to darkness? Or is it something more, some external force? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. The secret of steel always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. If I die, I have to go before him, and he will ask me, "What is the riddle of steel?" If I don't know it, he will cast me out of Valhalla and laugh at me.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We all have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and today we're exploring Conan's old world, Hyperborea. The interesting aspect of sword and sorcery literature, and we're told that the Conan stories written by author Robert E. Howard was the father of sword and sorcery tales. How does it relate to high fantasy, though, and how does Robert E. Howard's world that he devised in the 1930s fit into our five eras timeline? Maybe it doesn't fit into our five eras timeline, but could it be an early portion of what we consider the Fourth Era or the Tartarian Era? Or could it be that these stories took place during the Second or Third Eras, and that they recount tales and stories and civilizations from those time frames? We're going to explore that today. We're also going to consider the fact that maybe these are all just fictional stories that someone who only lived for 30 years improvised from their wondrous creativity and imagination. We start by considering the account of Robert E. Howard, the author himself, and the Hyborian Age. Now, the Hyborian Age is what Robert E. Howard, the author, referred to as the time that his main character, Conan the Barbarian, lived in. The Hyborian Age is a contraction of the land Hyperborea, which was a legendary land that the Greeks had thought existed in the north, or what we think of as the Arctic Circle today. Oddly enough, these are the same Greeks that we attribute the foundation of civilization to, and yet we also say that they were superstitious fools who didn't exactly know the layout of their own land. Once again, another conflicted account, this time with what we consider to be the foundation of our current civilization, at least in the mainstream. Looking at the land that Howard improvised or innovated, if you go off of the mainstream account, you can see that there are many parallels with our current land, and yet it looks very different. We consider the fact that the nature of the land may have changed through reset after reset. But who exactly was Robert E. Howard, and what was unique about him as an author? Robert E. Howard was born and lived in Texas his entire life. He only lived for 30 years, 1906 to 1936, during a questionable time, the Roaring Twenties, and of course the Great Depression, which we've looked at many times. Robert E. Howard was a self-taught author. He was someone who taught himself the art of writing, and he had a very difficult life from what we understand. At least he was self-conflicted as an individual. Again, this is the mainstream account. We, oddly enough, know little about him as a person aside from what's written about him. And yet, in the 1930s, he was the one who innovated these fantasy tales, this sword and sorcery genre. Indeed, he's considered the father of sword and sorcery genre, even though he only lived to be 30 years old, and he only had one novel about the Conan stories. Predominantly, the Conan stories and the Hyborian essay that he wrote were simply to appear in many periodicals as short stories. The other interesting thing about Robert E. Howard is the fact that he only did live 30 years, and yet he had this creativity and imagination to innovate this entire world from his mind. He was also a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft and seemed to share many of the aspects of other realms and the concept of portals and greater powers influencing the world or the land. Yet at the same time, he also disputed H.P. Lovecraft's view of civilization. Howard believed that civilization represented a threat to the individual, whereas Lovecraft was a proponent of civilization. Again, that's what the mainstream tells us. Who knows what the reality is? What was truly interesting, though, about Howard's stories at the time was that they touched on an entirely new genre that supposedly hadn't been revealed to the public before in fiction. Also recall that when most of these Conan stories were originally published as short stories, it was during the time of the Great Depression, and we're also told that Howard was afflicted by the Great Depression. In Howard's fictional narrative, he actually started with stories of Kull the King, which talked about the Thurian continent, or the Thurian Age. This was the time frame that preceded the Hyborian Age, and oddly enough, it refers to Thul, it refers to Atlantis, and Lemuria. Indeed, Howard seemed to recognize that these were civilizations during this particular age. And then there was a great cataclysm, and then this entire civilization was destroyed. And so you can already see that we have many of the allusions to the things that we explore in our Five Eras theory and looking at the old world. Now, once again, this could have just all been the fictional mindset of an inspired author in the 1930s in Texas. And you can look and see some of the examples from the Thurian Age, or the Age of King Kull. King Kull himself was from Atlantis. And it's odd to consider that Howard was referring to a time when Atlantis existed. Indeed, he states that when the Hyborian Age occurred, it was between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, or what we consider to be the more quote-unquote modern civilizations, Sumer and Babylon. We'll also be exploring them here in the near future. It's intriguing, though, that what Howard's view of this point is that this particular series of civilizations had magic and had many other intricacies involved in its civilization. And recall that we're told that Howard considered civilization evil, although if you go off of mainstream history, one could understand why we would have that perception. Although we don't really know much about Howard directly. We know that the Thurian Age was succeeded by the Hyborian Age, and this was the age in which Conan the Barbarian, the eponymous character of Howard's most well-known stories, and the very well-known movie that was made in the early 1980s, launching the acting career of Arnold Schwarzenegger. What makes Conan special, and what makes the Hyborian Age that Robert E. Howard wrote about unique? It improvised, in many ways, story elements that were told were not in existence at that time. It also incited the start of the sword and sorcery genre. Now you're probably asking, what's the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy, or what we think of with the Lord of the Rings series, which we explored in the works of Tolkien last year on this channel? Sword and sorcery allegedly just involve stories that are simply a single individual struggling in the same sort of environment that you tend to see in high fantasy, whereas high fantasy stories, primarily written by Tolkien, involve the entire fate of the world. At least that's the simple way to understand the differences between high fantasy and sword and sorcery, yet they involve many of the same elements. Of course, there's also the perception that sword and sorcery tends to reflect a much more violent and individualistic nature, which supposedly goes along with the values that Robert E. Howard embraced. The other interesting thing looking at Hyboria, though, is supposedly Howard was inspired by the existence of nations, and certain kingdoms within Hyboria, or the Hyborian Age that existed, Aquilonia and several others, are allegedly inspired by real-life kingdoms, or real-life city-states in Italy even, such as Aquilonia. However, in the film, we also see a wonderful depiction and an interpretation of what Howard may have imagined. We also have to remember that most of the works of Conan were written by other authors over time. Since Howard passed away, he committed suicide in 1936. We're told that he had a difficult life, and there are many different theories in terms of his internal struggles and conflicts. We just don't know exactly what was going on. It is rather interesting, though, that an individual who only lived to be 30 years managed to completely create this entire world, just with their creativity and imagination. Now, I'm not questioning if Howard did this. It's another interesting consideration, much in the same way as J.R.R. Tolkien, or even more contemporaneously, George R.R. Martin. These entire worlds that are created that give us a reflection of a very distant past time, and yet they show reset events. Consider the character of Conan himself. Conan represents the barbarian. It's in the title, Conan the Barbarian. He represents the ultimate individual from Howard's perception. The person who actually reflects qualities and values that are, according to Howard in the stories, superior to the individuals that live in civilizations. Yet, really, when it comes down to this superiority, it's not so much in one person being seen as better than the other. It's the fact that Conan embraces certain values that tend to be lost in civilizations. So perhaps Howard was simply given a warning in his character of Conan. You see no shortage of exotic creatures in elaborate accounts, such as snakes that are 80 feet long. And to this day, we have several accounts of alleged cryptid sightings of gigantic snakes in distant areas across the land. Maybe they exist, maybe they do not. Or maybe they existed in the past. Our mainstream says that giant snakes existed in the past. Of course, it's in the very distant past, as it always is. A lot of the landscapes and civilizations, and indeed the existential threat that was facing Hyperborea, was indeed reflected by the presence of snakes, or the worship of the snake god Set. And we'll discuss that when we look into the civilization of Stygia in Hyboria. Oddly enough, there is also numerous references to the power of a new form of religion and influence, which indeed was the worship of Set, which is very well reflected in the early 1980s movie, when we see not just the worship of snakes, but also the concept of embracing an identity of void. And indeed, the individual who is responsible for this, the character Thulsa Doom, embraces a twisted misanthropy in the film. We also see how Conan acquires his great sword, an Atlantean sword, when he falls into an old Atlantean tomb. And we see that the Atlantean king, or general, or whatever you want to think of him as, is a giant individual. Now again, this is just reflected in the story, but there's also a lot of symbolism. Indeed, what made the original Conan the Barbarian so successful as a film was that it relied a lot more on symbolism, on music, and on telling a story through visual elements instead of dialogue. Conan doesn't really speak a lot of dialogue, and indeed this happened to cater to the strengths of Arnold Schwarzenegger's ability to convey a physical performance. And not to denigrate Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting capability, but you're simply catering to an individual's strengths, and it's one of the reasons why the film worked so incredibly well. It also had a wondrous theme concerning the riddle of steel. What was the real search behind it? And the film doesn't tell you what the answer to the riddle of steel is, but it does display it very clearly in the entire plot. The other threats that Conan faces do tend to be the corruption of civilization, and that's depicted both in the original stories and in the way that it's depicted in the film. Now, there's numerous changes made to Howard's original characters, and of course, if you go to the city in Italy to this day, that Aquilonia was inspired by, one of the kingdoms in Hyboria, you'll see that they have a nice collection of bells there. And that's just another little odd coincidence that we have when we consider the power of bells and what they could be representing in our many previous civilizations. There's also statements that Howard was inspired by individuals such as the Picts and other tribes that supposedly existed in history, but strangely enough, we have conflicting accounts about them as well, in terms of how civilized they were, how advanced they were, and it tends to create many different conflicting accounts. Officially, we're told that the reason Howard did not want to utilize actual history was it would have been too difficult to do the research to incorporate it into his stories at the time. Yet, he didn't have a Carnegie Library nearby in Texas, and of course we're well aware of many libraries at that time. We're also told that he innovated these great kingdoms and these lands in this time of Hyboria. But what would have been easier? Would it have been easier simply to go off of what was already written, or to innovate it? Or is it possible that he was actually consulting a different historical account, an alternate series of events? We even have accounts of apes that evolved into men that evolved further beyond that, and within a very compressed time period. A lot of people will find that there was a lot of controversy in Howard's works at the time, although the concept of controversy evaluating Howard's work seems to ebb and flow depending on the current state of events, which we can really say about anything. We certainly love to discuss how everything's controversial here in the 2000s. But you also see the other element of the Hyborian age with the constant conflicts and civilizations that are rising and falling, and that's something else that Howard tended to emphasize in his works, and indeed in some of the letters that we have in his exchanges with H.P. Lovecraft, he argued for the fact that there never really was one dominant civilization. Civilizations would rise, civilizations would fall. There was never really one that would ultimately hold the keys towards eternal existence. And yet Howard believed that the real strength, the real enduring quality of human beings was actually in the strength of the individual. And that explains a lot of his viewpoints and what we see in the stories. Now let's look at Stygia and Thulsadum. Stygia was considered a corrupted nation, a corrupted land that worshipped the snake god Set. There's a lot of interesting elements when you consider Stygia, especially given their entire culture and society. The high priests of Set within Stygia held all the influence. Now, supposedly Stygia was inspired by many different civilizations that are actually written about in history, and indeed we have no shortage of supposed honest historical accounts that talk about the primacy of sacrifice and how that would contribute to a civilization in the past. We certainly enjoy attributing that to the Aztecs, and it's one of the darker aspects of that civilization, if it did in fact occurred. Yet, oddly enough, when you step far enough back, you can find many examples of sacrifice, conducted in many different formats. Of course, the justification for sacrifice changes. In the past, we're told that sacrifice was done by a superstitious people, so it would preclude the natural events of the world overcoming them. And yet, one of the darker elements of Stygia is the fact that they took sacrifice as an essential element of their society. There's no shortage of depictions, innovations, and creative artistic renderings that show how these sacrifices that were dedicated to the snake god of Set were conducted in Stygia. And indeed, the priests of Stygia and what they proposed for maintaining their civilization in balance with nature is a very alarming and disturbing story to look at. There is also the entire presence of snakes. Now, recall that earlier in explorations on this channel, we don't want to condemn simply the presence of snakes, but it comes down to how the symbolism is used and employed when we look at Stygia. It's also stepping back and looking at this kingdom, this civilization that supposedly came from the mind of Robert E. Howard, and yet there's some other disturbing elements that seem to bear some sort of realism in it. There's even the account of the snake god Set himself, or itself. The fact that it exists in multiple dimensions, that it can travel through portals, that it has all sorts of power. The power to deceive, the power to transform, the power to assume multiple forms, the power to create and destroy. We're even told that between the Thurian and the Hyborian age, or if you want to see as a reset being between those, Set was always one of the main individuals, the main deities that opposed the progress of humanity. And normally this was done in the stories through the advent of a corrupted civilization, which was represented by Stygia. In the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian, we see that the main character Thulsa Doom, who was also an antagonist from the original stories, albeit in a very different incarnation, embraced the concept of the worship of Set. And this is the commonality that you see. The character is wonderfully portrayed by James Earl Jones in the 1982 film. And his Thulsa Doom is of an ancient race that's been nearly extinct. The dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom is over 1,000 years old. And he's recruited several priests who have wondrous warrior capabilities, and here you see the High Priest Rexer on the right, and his assistant Thorgrim. These are the individuals in the film that carry out the will of Thulsa Doom. And indeed we see Rexor pictured here, who is no doubt Thulsa Doom's chosen successor. They recruit a group of followers, which quickly grows into the thousands and tens of thousands, and the dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom's snake cult is spreading across the entire world. Every single city has built a tower dedicated to the worship of Set. The people seem to be aware that this is an evil, terrifying threat, and yet no one really seems to have the will to do much of anything about it. Aside from King Osric, whose daughter is recruited by Thulsa Doom to be at his side. And indeed, the main plot element involves King Osric recruiting Conan, Valeria, and Subutai, his companions, to rescue his daughter from the clutches of Thulsa Doom. Thulsa Doom is portrayed wonderfully by James Earl Jones in the fact that he has an understanding of what the Riddle of Steel is really about. He also has tremendous charisma and influence over his followers. The fact that Thulsa Doom can speak with a voice and character inflections such as James Earl Jones, you can see that there's a lot of sense to many of the things that he's stating. When he talks about some of the unfortunate traits of individuals to be easily corrupted. He also shows and displays the power of influence that he has over his followers, when he asks one of his followers to simply come to him and jump off a cliff to her very untimely demise. And one of the points that he makes is the fact that he has this kind of influence, that this is true power. And many people simply give up their own will, or don't practice their own will, and succumb to the nature of Thulsa Doom. And here you see a very adequate depiction of what was represented by Stygia and this worship of the cult of Set. There is even the fact that Thulsa Doom himself can transform into a large snake, and it's depicted quite directly in the film, where we see Thulsa Doom transform into a snake, and it gives us a showcase of his magical capability, and indeed the unique aspects of the species that he was originally a member of. I like the fact, though, that the film gives you clues about it. It shows you his capability, but it doesn't have to explain the origin in detail, because oftentimes we do have mystery in life. And it doesn't affect the plot of the film, and it doesn't affect what's displayed with solving the Riddle of Steel, but it does give you some clues in terms of how powerful and charismatic certain individuals can be. And we all have to decide if a charismatic individual is really acting on our behalf or not. And you can see here the original depiction of Thulsa Doom as Robert E. Howard allegedly innovated the character. I don't believe that it betrays the actual vision, though, of Robert E. Howard, as the film did combine many of the elements that he had in his original stories, and it did represent many of the themes that he wanted to convey. Indeed, we have to consider the Riddle of Steel to understand the fundamental values. And what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Throughout the film, it begins with a monologue between Conan and his father. And that was one of the quotes at the start of this exploration, where Conan's father explains that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, the entire film revolves around events of Conan's life. A lot of people think that the original Conan the Barbarian is simply a revenge story. Conan's going to seek Thulsa Doom because Thulsa Doom raided Conan's village to kill Conan's people, his mother, his father, and then steal his father's sword, because as Thulsa Doom said later, he believed that weapons of steel were the key to success. And indeed, we see the terrifying scene where Conan has to witness the slaughter of his mother and his father right in front of his eyes. That's the opening event of his life that occurs shortly after his father tells him about the Riddle of Steel. So, the entire film is about the events of Conan's life. And really it's about Conan going through events and experiencing things and trying to solve the riddle of steel. And as he relays to Subutai, his companion who's a thief later in the film once he grows up, he says that he has to solve the riddle of steel. But what is the answer to the riddle of steel? Many people have said that it's simply an expression of will. It's that simple. And indeed, we see Conan's will tested when he's captured after his village is destroyed, and he's chained to the wheel of pain, which he pushes for years. We're given the impression that the other survivors from the raid died over time, but only Conan survived, and he achieved a body of great strength and capability just by surviving and pushing the wheel. Conan is recruited to be a pit fighter, and he is involved in many pit fights in which he has no choice but to kill his opponent every time. And so we see that the initial events of Conan's life have been tragedy. He's forced into situations of terrifying violence, witnessing the death of his parents, and then having to kill himself in order to survive. However, as a result of his victories, he's given an education, and he's brought to a higher status. Indeed, he's able to develop himself as an individual, even with the constraints of his particular situation. And soon he earns his freedom, freed by the very individual who had employed him in pit fighting, and he goes off on his own to seek vengeance against Thulsa Doom. Eventually he finds Thulsa Doom, the individual who led the raid of his village, who tells him that flesh is stronger than steel, that he will tell him the answer to the riddle of steel. And indeed, that's exactly how Thulsa Doom depicts it, that flesh is stronger. And he makes a very direct allusion to where the real power is, what is steel compared to the hand that wields it, and shows Conan that his influence and power over his followers is infinitely more powerful than the material of steel. He has Conan crucified, and Conan nearly dies until he's rescued by his companions. And it's at this point that Conan begins to reflect inwardly. He's learned through his life and his experiences, and he understands that what he really has to achieve is self-awareness. And when we see the kata after Conan survives his crucifixion, we understand that he's achieved self-awareness. In his final battle against Rexor, Thulsa Doom's high priest, Conan frees himself by breaking his father's sword in combat. This is symbolic. It represents Conan breaking the chains of his past and achieving his self-awareness, and ultimately his self-agency. While he's broken his father's sword, he still shows tribute to his past. He still understands his connections. But now he's no longer bound by it. He has the ability to impose his own purpose, his own values in life. And it's represented during the time when he wins this duel and wins back his father's sword, which he uses to confront Thulsa Doom and ultimately kill Thulsa Doom. Now, it may seem like it's a vengeance story, but behind it, under the surface, we see that Conan has sorted out the riddle of steel. And the answer to the riddle of steel is that self-agency is what everything is about. Achieving self-awareness through your experiences, that gives you the ability to impose will. That is the answer to the riddle of steel. So what era was the Hyborian Age and the Thurian Age, or whatever you want to call these time frames? Remember that the Thurian Age came first. Did it actually happen in the Second Era, and that's when we had the Thurian Age? Or did the Thurian Age come in the Third Era? We could see that in any point where we want to see Atlantis and Lemuria actually happening. There's indications for both. Or what about Hyboria? Did the Hyborian Age occur in the Third Era, or did it occur in the Fourth Era? Or is it possible that these were all just from the imagination of Robert E. Howard, and that this is all just a fiction? I do consider that possibility. There's also another perception that perhaps both these ages occurred in a single area, the Thurian Age and the Hyborian Age in the Second or the Third Era. Because remember, we don't exactly have a hard and fast line defining between resets. Or maybe they occurred in the Fourth Era, at the start before the Tartarian civilization. It's an interesting look to see how different people have viewed the past. And it is possible that Robert E. Howard may have had some access, or may simply be another, how shall we say, placeholder individual that released a lot of this information, some sort of disclosure. It could also be possible that this is also similar to what we see released through the works of George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. We just don't know. And yet, when we see these allusions to past and previous civilizations, we realize that there could be much more to this in terms of fact and in terms of historicity. It is rather strange that Robert E. Howard managed to compose an entire Hyborian essay in which he outlined this entire world that he supposedly just envisioned in his mind. Now, I don't want to discredit a single individual's creativity and imagination, but remember that Robert E. Howard lived a very difficult life, and he only lived for 30 years. And yet he was able to innovate something, an entire world all of his own, which other authors and other creators were able to run with for decades, and even continuing to this day. So what do you think? Is it possible that this Hyborian age really occurred in history, or is it all just from the imagination of one individual? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. Many wars and feuds did Conan fight. Honor and fear were heaped upon his name. In time he became a king by his own hand, and this story shall now be told.
One man will control the entire civilized world.
Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We will have you. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
The incredible world of Conan, and we explore King Conan, the Phoenix on the Sword. Robert E. Howard crafted the Hyborian Age, a world of sword and sorcery. Yet with all the details within it, what was he really saying about the prospect of civilization? How does the individual barbarian spirit of Conan fit into this civilized world that Robert E. Howard had designed? I was always very impressed by the fact that Robert E. Howard, who'd only lived to be 30 years old, had crafted this entire world, filling in its background. It may fit into one of the previous eras in our 5 eras theory, or it may not. And I certainly invite you to let me know in the comments what you think. Either way, whether Robert E. Howard had actually imagined and created this world from his own mind, or he was inspired by some sort of other force that we can't even begin to imagine, or some sort of collective memory. Conan's old world in the Hyborian Age is impressive because of the detail behind it. Remember that J.R.R. Tolkien spent the rest of his life filling in the details behind the world of Arda that he created in his high fantasy of Lord of the Rings. Conan and his companions, beginning in the land of Samaria and seeking adventure all throughout this lush and fertile landscape of the land of Hyperborea, or the Hyborian Age, the names of the land and the different names of the age that it actually inhabited. Wicked and ancient civilizations, usurpers seeking to take rule and subvert this civilization. And Conan finally becoming a king after overcoming the efforts of the Stygian wizards and many other adventures, where Conan would become king in Aquilonia, where he sat upon the throne with a troubled brow. We recount this initial tale of Conan's ruling of Aquilonia. The plot comes from the story The Phoenix on the Sword. It was a short story by Robert E. Howard. A middle-aged Conan of Samaria tries to govern the turbulent kingdom of Aquilonia. Conan has recently seized the crown from King Numidides III after strangling the tyrant on his throne. But the Cimmerian is more suited to swinging his broadsword than signing official documents. A common challenge that we see for many who rise to positions of power and responsibility. Or is Robert E. Howard warning us of the unfortunate apparatus of civilization and what it could really signify. The Aquilonians, who originally welcomed Conan as their liberator, have turned against him due to his foreign blood, and construct a statue to Numidides' memory in the Temple of Mitra. Priests burn incense before their slain king, hailing it as the holy effigy of a saintly monarch who was killed by a red-handed barbarian. A band known as the Rebel Four forms. Volmana, the dwarfish Count of Caraban. Gromel, the giant commander of the Black Legion. Dion, the fat baron of Attalus. And Rinaldo, the harebrained minstrel. Their goal is to put the crown in the hands of someone with royal blood, and to this end they recruit the services of a southern outlaw named Ascalante. However, Ascalante secretly plans to betray his employers and claim the crown. Ascalante also enslaves Tartaria, a Stygian wizard who has fallen on hard times. A thief had stolen Tartaria's ring and left him defenseless, forcing him to flee from Stygia. While disguised as a camel driver, he was waylaid and caught by Ascalante's reavers. The rest of his caravan was slaughtered, but Tartaria saved himself by revealing his identity and swearing to serve Ascalante. The conspirators plan to assassinate King Conan when he's unprepared and defenseless. But Tartaria discovers that his ring of power is in Dion's possession, murders him, and summons a fanged ape-like demon to slay Ascalante. Conan in turn is warned of this event in a dream by a long-dead sage named Epimetiris, who marks Conan's sword with a mystical phoenix representing Mitra, a Hyborian god. Conan awakens and, prepared for the attack, slays the 3 remaining members of the rebel 4, breaking his sword upon the helm of Gromel and using a battle axe against the rest of his would-be assassins. Conan hesitates to kill Rinaldo, whose songs once touched the king's heart. The scruple proves costly, as Rinaldo manages to stab him before being killed. Ascalante, his goal in reach, moves to finish off the wounded king, but is killed by Tartaria's demon before he can strike, and the demon is then slain by Conan with the shard of his enchanted sword. Conan's courtiers hesitate to believe his tale, as the demon has evaporated, until they spot the shape its blood is left on the floor. In the tale The Scarlet Citadel, an older, wiser King Conan of Aquilonia receives a call for help from Amalric, the ruler of neighboring Ophir. Amalric claims that Strabonus, the emperor of Koth, is threatening his kingdom. Conan marches into Ophir with an army of 5,000 Aquilonian knights. His planned campaign is a trap. The 2 monarchs are working together to destroy him with the help of a Kothian wizard named Sotha Inti. The Aquilonian knights are cut down by the Kothian cavalry, while Conan is imprisoned within a Korashmesh dungeon. This dungeon is used by Tosotha Intal for nefarious experiments, and Conan discovers many bizarre horrors during his escape. Conan frees Peleus, a former rival wizard, who helps him escape the dungeon and regain his position as king of Aquilonia. The story climaxes with a gigantic battle, where the adversaries of Conan meet a grisly fate at his hands. In Conan of Aquilonia, we have one of the final stories. In his late 50s, King Conan of Aquilonia engages in his final struggle with his arch-foe, the black magician Tartaria of Stygia, servant of the evil god Set. First, Conan must journey into Hyperborea and rescue his kidnapped son, Prince Kon, from an unholy alliance between Tartaria and the witch queen, Luhai. Next, Conan and Kon carry out the struggle to their enemy's stronghold in Stygia itself at the head of an invading army, with the aid of a druid named Divietix. Pursuing their defeated foe southward, they confront him again, first in the kingdom of Zimbabwe, and, at last, near the very edge of the world, where Conan and Tartaria face each other in a final astral duel. Conan of Aquilonia depicts the coming of age of Conan's son, Kon. In the beginning, Kon is still very much of a boy, and is afraid of a heavy belting, which he could expect from his father for disobedience. By the end, he's already a seasoned warrior, who took part in various kinds of battle, escaped from capture, avoided imminent death, saved his father's life, and has a crucial role in the final defeat of Conan's old enemy, Tartaria, making him ready to succeed as King Conan II, which he would 7 years hence in Conan of the Isles. What exactly was Robert E. Howard really trying to warn us about civilization in these tales of King Conan of Aquilonia? I always found it interesting that the Conan franchise, when brought to film in the early 1980s, thanks to the efforts of John Milius and Raffaele De Laurentiis, is that the film is oftentimes considered controversial. It's not a true representation of Conan, the original character created by Robert E. Howard. On the other hand, differing perspectives say it absolutely is a representation of what that world would really be like. And while it may simply be a simple, or what appears to be a simple revenge plot story, it does have many other of the elements that Robert E. Howard would work into his stories. The warning about the potential evil of civilizations. Take Subuntai's line, civilization, ancient and wicked. It's always that representation of civilization that we see in Robert E. Howard's works. It's very impressive the amount of detail that he managed to weave into a complex narrative with the entire Conan story. Even more impressive that Robert E. Howard lived to be 30 years old. Now, I make mention of that because that's a tremendous accomplishment of creative ingenuity in a very limited period of time. To convey and create and fabricate this entire world that hadn't existed before. You may recall in our previous exploration of Conan, when we looked into the tales of Robert E. Howard, he had a very limited amount of time to put all of this together. Compare and contrast this with the incredible detail of the world that J.R.R. Tolkien and his son, and ultimately grandson, helped to fill in some of the details over a very long period of time. Now, one of the challenges that we see in modern storytelling, whether it's for entertainment purposes or to actually have an educational purpose behind it, and is it intriguing how our civilization always assigns purposes to everything? Something is either one thing entirely or it's something else entirely. It's rare that it can actually be considered both, or that two things can be true at the same time. Looking at the depiction of civilization, though, whether you're looking at the original stories of Robert E. Howard or you're looking at the more current films, and yes, I'll include the much derided and probably rightfully so sequel Conan the Destroyer. One of the controversies was the fact that Conan the Destroyer was made to appeal to more of a younger audience, instead of focusing on telling a good story. And while it did have some good details in it, the score is still rousing and epic, much like the original film Conan the Barbarian. It seemed to lose some of the, how shall we say, dramatic flavor that was in the original Conan the Barbarian and the original stories of Robert E. Howard. Because why is it these stories still have such a mass appeal to the audience? Why is it one of the central themes in Robert E. Howard's story is the ultimate struggle of the individual, and not just any individual, but an individual who is designated as a barbarian, to struggle to achieve against the wicked element of civilization? One can't help but study and look at how King Conan fits into his new role as King of Aquilonia. In the stories, we realize that he has to overcome internal dissent from the very people that he's ultimately freed from a tyrant. And why is it that we have these stories of all these tyrants in this entire sword and sorcery genre? Now, again, going back to the concept of categorization, you look at even how fantasy is broken down. You have high fantasy and you have sword and sorcery genre with their own respective listed differences. Now, you could simply say that that's merely an academic discipline, once again enforcing its categorization and its cataloging on all sorts of things to include stories that were originally intended as entertainment. Or were they? There's always that hard question. And perhaps that's the real appeal about studying the works of Robert E. Howard and Conan, and really sword and sorcery as a genre in general. What we see are details that do appear to have many elements of reality to them. Take one of the films that was inspired by Conan the Barbarian, Sword and the Sorcerer. Ah yes, sword and sorcery right in the name. And yet there's an intriguing mix of historical detail with elements of fantasy. We also consider the concept of fairy tales, where once again we're trying to find that dividing line between what was real and what was imagined. I myself always find it intriguing that we have such creativity and imagination from groups of people in time frames where we're informed that these people were not encouraged to use their imagination, that they fanatically had to believe in what they were told to believe, and if they didn't believe in what they were told to believe, then they faced harsh consequences, oftentimes death or imprisonment, and you can consider that a permanent solution. And yet we see the brutality that's displayed in Conan's world, drawn up by Robert E. Howard. There's a real point, though, behind the brutality. It's not simply violence for the sake of violence. Oftentimes, the violence is a means because there is no other end to achieve. Or is it just simply wordplay? Someone will say, well, once again, you're just using word salad. But you can read the stories yourself, you can watch Conan the Barbarian, and you can see how the character is driven to violence as no other recourse. You can see that oftentimes it's done all in the name of survival. But when he ascends to the throne of Aquilonia, You read about this brutal killing, his overcoming of the previous king, the king that he would supplant, as he would become Conan the Usurper. Now, words and terminologies all have different meanings. To the people of Aquilonia, Conan had indeed become an usurper. And yet, in the long term, he would bring about a more prosperous kingdom. He would bring in that element of barbarian individual survival that he had invoked his entire life, and impose that upon the civilization of Aquilonia. Now, why is that so relevant? Why does that detail matter so much? Recall that Robert E. Howard himself is claimed to have stated that civilizations were wicked and evil, and that he oftentimes, in his correspondences with contemporary H.P. Lovecraft, disagreed on the role of civilization with the individual. It's very clear, though, that Robert E. Howard understood there was a need for civilization, but he did not believe in having civilization overrun the individual, whereas H.P. Lovecraft may have had different views on the matter. Whatever the conclusion, though, we can see that when he became King Conan of Aquilonia, we see this theme very present, and it's probably the reason why we will never see an adaptation of the stories of Conan actually ascending to the throne of Aquilonia, where he would wear the crown upon a troubled brow. The meaning and the theme behind all of that, though, is critical, because it shows that in the final phase of his life, Conan, through all of his experiences, not learning through a particular institution, not actually going through any sort of formal education system, but merely his experiences encountering different cultures, different peoples, some people operating for good, others operating for evil, understanding what is really going to be required to bring about a successful civilization. Understanding that the will of the individual should never be trumped into the ground for any particular reason, simply because the apparatus of the civilization says it's for the best. And yet this seems to be exactly what Robert E. Howard is warning about in all of his works and all the themes of Conan. And this is even carried through in both of the movies from the early 1980s. Now, I'll admit I've never bothered to see the remake or the reimagining or whatever we want to call it from the 2000s because, well, it just didn't really appeal to me. But maybe it's a good movie, I don't really know. But understanding exactly what these ideas are and why the character and this time frame of Conan is so appealing, I think it's critical to understanding how it connects to a possible old world reference. It is entirely possible, much as we've posited in the cases of J.R.R. Tolkien and indeed many other science fiction writers, or fantasy writers, depending on what particular genre we wish to assign their works, that they were actually warning us of this struggle that came in the distant past, and perhaps even in the near past. And some would even argue it's a struggle that continues to this day, although we could also argue that this struggle that's happening to this day is a very guided and controlled struggle. That conflict is limited to regional areas, and it seems to have many very definitive outcomes that seem to have been ingrained from the very start. Now, the counter-argument could be made that that's simply the national objectives of whatever nation-states are engaging in, or whatever greater political entities, and whether you want to believe that there's this concept of an international community, and that's terminology that you'll see if you go to certain non-governmental organization and their training schools, you'll see that term and hear it bandied about quite frequently, international community. But is there really an international community, or is there just simply the principles of guidance? Oddly enough, this seemed to be what Robert E. Howard had when he considered civilization as being a form of corruption. The real warning that we see, though, with King Conan of Aquilonia, is that civilization is like many other things, whether it's an institution, an apparatus, an organization, or even a simple tool, or even going very direct to the Conan analogy of the concept of the sword. A weapon, a tool, a civilization, an apparatus, all can be used for purposes of good, and yet all can just as easily be subverted for purposes of evil. Consider the possibility if you have this concept of governments as Hobbes relates in his book Leviathan. In his book Leviathan, Hobbes states that the government, or sovereign as he euphemistically calls it, has full authority. And regardless of what type of government there is, whether it's a democratically elected government, an absolute monarch, or any other form of government, it has the total authority to impose whatever ruling conditions on its people that it desires. And that because of the fact that the people are under its rule, then de facto they have consented to that rule. Again, it doesn't matter what type of government it is, the government simply has authority. The people have no authority and no accountability over the government. Now, I'm not saying that any current government applies this philosophy. This is merely the warning that came from Hobbes when he wrote Leviathan. This connects to the warning that Robert E. Howard was trying to convey. Now, where did these warnings actually come from? We've debated before on the concept of if Robert E. Howard had actually created the entire Hyborian Age from his mind, from his creative ingenuity. The official stated reason for doing this was he lacked the access, or at least lacked the time, to actually reference historical events. Apparently, he originally intended to set the character of Conan in an entire historically motivated environment that was actually based on the real history. But what's easier? Is it easier and more time efficient to simply reference an entire world that already exists? Another interesting thing that we've seen happen, whether we're talking about the forces of entertainment, or as we call them, intellectual properties now, is the concept of world building. How much time does it really take for a creator to do world building, or the lore behind all of these different worlds? There are some who even argue that certain intellectual properties are actually undermined by the efforts to try to establish the lore, and then to actually try to program the lore into current releases. For example, it's very, very interesting relating a story that has compelling characters and a very compelling plot that are interwoven together. But what if the actual aim or objective of your story is to simply fill in the background information? Is it interesting to read a story about the background information? Or is it more interesting to simply watch a film that gives you the background information? Or read a book that's cataloged like an encyclopedia? Some people enjoy that, some people don't. What's the real purpose behind providing this lore? Does the lore in its own subtle way actually change the theme of the original stories? These warnings that we have of these usurpers, the fact that civilization itself does have many very well documented examples, whether it's in entertainment, fiction, or in history, of those that have subverted its apparatus for their own evil intentions. And yes, I say the word evil very directly because that's what we're informed it is. It's very clear what's good and what's evil. That's also part of what comes with history, a declaration, if you will. And that declaration continues to this very day. Whether it's absolutely true or absolutely false, well, it's ultimately for you to decide. But perhaps the most interesting detail behind the struggles that Conan the Cimmerian faced when he took the crown of Aquilonia is establishing his rule over the rebellious people of Aquilonia. And even though he was seen as an outsider, even though this struggle existed, ultimately Conan's intentions were good. Ultimately, he established a period of prosperity for Aquilonia. And why is that, according to Howard? Because Conan had the values of individuality, because he was willing to impose that freedom to the people. And what is ultimately the difference between freedom and liberty? Well, we love to talk about these words. We love to talk about what they actually mean. But simply allowing an individual to be themselves is, oddly enough, something that tends to be denied in many of these subverted civilizations that we see. Again, whether they're mentioned in fiction or whether they're actually mentioned in our true history. And make no mistakes about it. Think about how our own concept of the Middle Ages or the medieval times has evolved over our own historical studies. How was it they were able to build all those incredible cathedrals and castles with geometric precision and effort that was required to be put into such achievements? Now, the official history tells us that it took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort, but they evolved very quickly, even though many, if not all, these structures are very difficult to replicate to this day. And arguably, we could even say that they can't be replicated to this day, despite the fact that we've had an increase in technological capability. So again, relating back to the concept of apparatuses, institutions, tools, large-scale societal organization. there is something that Robert E. Howard really understood and saw very clearly. Now again, the man only lived to be 30 years old. A very short amount of time that people will constantly criticize. Well, people could achieve anything. Keep in mind that he lived during the time of the Great Depression. So if these stories of Conan the Barbarian all came from his mind and from his creative ingenuity, then it's yet something else that we can attribute during that time of the Great Depression that was creative and inspired, along with all the impressive Art Deco buildings that were still completed at the start of the Great Depression. Of course, then once World War II came around, that was the end of that. Is there something to be seen, though, when we look at these certain tyrants who do have human elements to them? We often talk about the fact that in our current entertainment we have a villain problem. We have villains that don't seem to be very human-like. For example, take the character of Titus Cromwell from Sword and the Sorcerer in 1982, portrayed by wonderful character actor Richard Lynch. Cromwell seemed like he was just the classic evil despot. But yet there was so much more behind his character that seemed to give us the impression that he really was a human being. And this factors into the cycle of civilizations. Cromwell was interesting as a character because he was a human who was subverted by his own desire for power. And yet he still had honorable inclinations that made him such an interesting character. He had the concept of honor in the fact that he wished for duels to be fought to their honorable conclusion. He did not appreciate intervention from his own war chancellor that stopped him from finishing a duel. And there was even a little bit of how shall we say, discontent that we see within the character at the start of the film Sword and the Sorcerer. Is this really why we have this impressive cycle of civilizations? That we have these individuals who try to seize power, but eventually they realize that power is just an illusion. That the only real power is mastery over yourself. Now, you can read things such as the 48 Laws of Power, and I'm sure Robert E. Howard would have made a wonderful example of that as being one of the primary, how shall we say, lures of power. Because what really is power? Well, people will tell you power is the ability to control others, and it's really no more complicated than that. Much like how the concept of politics goes back and forth. What is politics? Are politics actually who gets what, when, and where? Or is it really simply making people comfortable to tolerate whatever policies that are being imposed upon them? Policies which they have absolutely no control over. It's ultimately up to you to decide, but I think one of the finest examples and comparisons comes from the works of Robert E. Howard. And it's very compelling because he does show us this very barbaric and terrifying time, where we see the conflict between civilization and the individual. We find that in his story a balance is achieved between the individual inclinations of Conan and ultimately his son, learning through experience in life. It is through experience that they manage to temper their ability and gain the ultimate wisdom that's required to achieve a balance in a civilization. Now, another point of view might say that this is just simply a misleading cause, that it's completely impossible to achieve a balance within civilization. There will always be the haves and the have-nots. There will always be the 1 to 2% that control the 98%. It doesn't really matter what type of government or system of economics that you have, that's just simply the way it is. And perhaps you want to embrace this belief system. Maybe you think what they said in The Matrix is ultimately true, that human beings don't really want to live by the happiness of other human beings. They simply want to live by their misery, and that's just the natural order of things. And always be wary whenever you hear someone telling you that there's a natural order of things. Because who actually defines the natural order of things? Do we make it up as we go? Or is there some deity that's actually imposed it upon us? Or is there really no natural order of things? It's simply who has the power in the moment or the capability to do something in the moment. These are the concepts that we will continue to explore and the grand ideals as we go forward in our explorations. Because one of the most interesting things about the stories of Robert E. Howard and the sword and sorcery genre in general is this ultimate struggle we have of the individual against these dark forces. And sometimes these dark forces corrupt civilizations. Sometimes these dark forces are the very product of the civilizations themselves. And yet other times it's a mix of the human element within what develops in nature just to survive. perhaps that's why these stories are timeless to us, and why they have such a timeless detail within them that still resonates with us to this very day. You can go back and watch these stories, and they do seem to be the product of not just a different time, but almost an entirely different world. It's safe to say that going back and watching Sword and the Sorcerer or the original Conan the Barbarian now, you really do feel like you're being transplanted to an entirely different world. It's nothing like you're going to see if you go walk outside your door, and it couldn't be any more different than what you read when you just read the media headlines on whichever personal device that you happen to be using to read those media headlines on. But it seems like everything functions to keep us from really knowing ourselves, to keep us from being retrospective, introspective, because as we're constantly warned, if you indulge in too much of that, you'll simply be playing with some sort of mental aberration. And we're also informed that people that are more intelligent, or at least assessed as being more intelligent, are more susceptible to such mental aberrations. Again, these are all theories and themes that are shared with us by the mainstream. Whether you want to say it's the mainstream media or other institutions, it really doesn't matter. You don't have to look very far to see that's exactly what we're told every day. But perhaps the true and final example that we have from the character of Conan the Barbarian and the stories of Robert E. Howard and all the others that continued these stories and tried to regale them from their original source material is that what really matters the most is the individual, the will of the individual. If we go back to what the actual riddle of steel really means, that will is everything. And no matter what other forces there are, will can overcome anything. Whatever your goals and whatever your desires and whatever it is you really want to be in life, will is everything. But as always, I leave it to you. What do you believe? Do you believe that civilizations are inherently good? Are they inherently evil? Or are they just simply another instrument, something that can be used for both? Or is there something within the human condition that requires or necessitates anything and everything being subverted? Such as we see in the old examples of the characters of Titus Cromwell, villains that we don't have in current entertainment, because our villains in our current entertainment tend to be very, well, one-dimensional, or caricatures, or the fact that they just simply seem to be utterly incompetent, and therefore aren't very compelling. Is there a reason behind that? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.